Tonight I want to tell you about what happened to the clone army after the Empire replaced them. And I find myself coming back to this story often because it is, at its heart, a story about obsolescence and betrayal and the strange cruelty of being made for a purpose, and then discovering that purpose was always temporary. The Clone Wars lasted 3 years, from 22 BBY to 19 BBY, and in that time, roughly 3 million soldiers fought and died across the galaxy for the Galactic Republic, and almost all of them were the same person, grown in laboratory chambers on a water world called Camino, from the genetic template of a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. They were clones, and they gave their lives with a loyalty that was almost absolute, and they believed, genuinely, that they were serving something that mattered, that their sacrifice had weight and meaning. But what I want you to understand before we go any further is this. There was a reason they were made, and the reason they were made is also the reason they were unmade. So settle in, and let me take you back to the weeks after Order 66, to a clone trooper who wakes up alone in an Imperial barracks and begins to understand, very slowly, what he has become. The barracks on Syntax II were quiet in a way. The barracks had not been quiet in 3 years. During the Clone Wars, during those long campaigns across the Outer Rim and the core, the barracks had hummed with activity. Repairs, training, the low chatter of brothers moving between stations, the sound of armor being cleaned and checked and maintained by hands that had learned every piece of it by heart. Now there was only the hum of the ventilation system and the occasional sound of a single pair of boots on the floor grating, echoing in corridors that had housed hundreds. A clone trooper, a regular trooper of the 501st Legion, opened his eyes in a bunk that was not his own and lay for a moment in the darkness, trying to assemble the shape of what he remembered. His name was Cutter, and he was 23 years old by the calendar and 46 years old by his body, a distinction that made sense only if you understood how he had been made, which he did, because he had lived inside that discrepancy every moment of his life since awareness. He had a headache, a deep thrumming ache behind his eyes that he did not recall acquiring, and the last thing he could clearly remember was the order coming through the comm systems, the order from the Supreme Chancellor himself, framing the Jedi as traitors to the Republic, enemies of the state, and something in that order had carried weight, had seemed to bypass his thinking entirely and go straight into his hands, his muscles, his breath. He remembered moving with others, remembered the temple, remembered the precise weight of his rifle and the faces of Jedi falling and his own voice. Yes, his own voice. Saying nothing, doing nothing, thinking nothing except that this was the order and orders were what he was for. Then nothing. Then waking here. Cutter swung his legs out of the bunk, and the movement sent a spike of pain through his temples, sharp and sudden, and he pressed his palm against his face and waited for it to pass. The bunk was unfamiliar, and the barracks around him were wrong in a way he could not quite articulate, and then he understood. The insignia on the wall was wrong. Instead of the Republic roundel he had worn on his armor for 3 years, instead of the symbol he had been taught to defend with his life, there was a new symbol, an Imperial crest, a jagged thing like a cog or a sunburst, and it was everywhere. On the walls, on the doors, printed on newly distributed armor that were stacked in precise formations throughout the barracks. Phase II armor, the armor he had fought in, worn in the defense of, was being replaced with something new, sleeker, whiter, the kind of armor you would make if you were designing soldiers to look uniform and forgettable rather than like the individual warriors they had been. Cutter sat upright and took inventory of himself with the methodical clarity that 3 years of war had trained into his muscle memory. Armor removed, presumably during whatever had happened during the gap in his memory. Undersuit present intact. Weapons gone. Inhibitor chip, the small neural implant in his skull that all clones carried, the thing that regulated mood and controlled response, and though he had never had it articulated precisely in those terms, enforced obedience. Still there, a faint pressure behind his left eye that he had lived with since his early conditioning on Kamino that he barely noticed anymore. He stood slowly in the darkness of the barracks, and that was when he noticed the second thing. He was alone. Not metaphorically alone, not emotionally alone, but physically alone in what he knew was a barracks built to house 144 soldiers, and there was no one else here. The sleeping quarters were empty. The armory was sealed with fresh Imperial locks, and the window ports showed darkness. In the common area, his footsteps were the only sound echoing off walls that had held the low hum of brothers eating and talking and checking equipment, and now held nothing but air and the faint smell of something chemical, something used to sanitize. Cutter made his way to the communications station and tried to raise anyone. His unit, his brothers, the command center, the base adjutant, and got only static and the recorded voice of an Imperial operator informing him that his clearance was insufficient for that channel. There was a data slate on the desk, glowing with a single message, and he read it 3 times because the first 2 times he did not understand what he was reading, and then he understood, and it still made no sense. The message was from the base commander, dated 3 days prior, and it informed all clone personnel that the Galactic Empire had assumed control of all military operations, that the Jedi Order had been dissolved and its members identified as traitors, that clone troopers were to report for reassignment pending the Empire's evaluation of their continued service, and that any clone trooper unable to report would be classified as AWOL and subject to immediate termination. That was the phrase, subject to immediate termination. Cutter read it again and could not make it fit with anything he knew, could not find a space in his understanding where those words made sense in sequence. 3 years he had fought, 3 years he had bled, 3 years he and his brothers had been told that they were the salvation of the Republic, that their loyalty was the bedrock of everything the galaxy held precious. And now the Republic did not exist, and the thing that had replaced it wanted him dead for the crime of being exactly what he had been engineered to be. He stood in the empty barracks with that knowledge settling into him like sediment, and somewhere in the structure of his skull, his inhibitor chip hummed, a frequency so low he could barely feel it, and he understood, finally, that what he had been made for was over, and what came next was something his creators had not prepared him for at all. Cutter sat down very slowly in the communications chair and waited, in the dark, for whatever was going to happen to him next. So to understand what happened to the clone army after the Empire replaced them, you have to understand how they came to exist in the first place, and the particular way they were broken from the moment of their conception. 10 years before the first battle that would define them, a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyers walked into the offices of the Kaminoans on a planet called Kamino, far beyond the Outer Rim, on the edge of the galactic charts themselves. Kamino is an ocean world, and the Kaminoans are an amphibious species, tall, graceful, with long necks, and a culture built on the pursuit of genetic perfection, of creating life that is flawless by design. Sifo Dyers came to them with a commission, speaking on behalf of the Jedi Council, asking them to create an army of soldiers cloned from a single genetic template. A man named Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter, skilled and lethal. The Kaminoans agreed, and in the vast cloning facilities of Tapoka City, in enormous tubes filled with clear nutrient fluid, the work began. There is something I find myself thinking about when I picture those chambers, rows and rows of clones suspended in growth medium, their bodies assembling themselves inside artificial wombs, never knowing a mother, never knowing anything but the quiet hum of machines and the faint pulse of their own becoming. The Kaminoans accelerated the growth process so that a clone would age twice as fast as a normal human. A child born in 1 year would be a man at 10, ready for service before adolescence properly finished. It was efficient, and it was also, by any reasonable measure, a kind of violence. Alongside the accelerated aging, the Kaminoans made modifications to the clones' very nature, dampening their independence, making them less like their template, the unpredictable Jango Fett, and more obedient, more controllable, more docile. They were being engineered not just to be soldiers, but to be soldiers who would follow orders without question, without the kind of will that might lead them to ask why. And this is where the story becomes darker, because there was something else being built into them, something hidden even from the Kaminoans themselves. Hidden in the depths of each clone's brain, during their growth in those tanks, a small structure was being implanted, a tumor-like mass of organic material, a biochip, an inhibitor chip, ostensibly designed to suppress their aggression, to keep them docile. But its true purpose was something else entirely. Its true purpose was Order 66, a command that would one day burn through their minds and remake them into weapons pointed at the very people they loved. And the architect of this, the hand that moved in shadow, was Darth Sidious, who had orchestrated the entire commission, using Sifo-Dyas as his instrument without the Jedi Council ever knowing an army was being created for them at all. When Obi-Wan Kenobi discovered the cloning facilities on Kamino, tracking a lead in an assassination investigation, he found millions of clones in their growth tubes, row after row of identical faces suspended in the moment before consciousness. He was told they were made for the Republic, that they were a gift, a solution to a problem the Republic did not yet know it had. The clones began to be trained from childhood. Their accelerated minds taught combat and tactics and discipline in the training facilities within Topoka City, and they learned to follow orders because they were made to do so, coded into their very cells to obey. But something unexpected happened, something that no amount of genetic engineering could quite prevent. The clones became people. Despite their identical genomes, despite the programming meant to make them uniform and controllable, individual personalities emerged. One clone would cut his hair in a particular way, another would customize his armor with unique markings, a third would develop a sense of humor, another a fierce loyalty to his brothers, another a quiet thoughtfulness. They began to call themselves by names: Rex, Cody, Fives, Echo, Tup, and countless others, each carrying within them an identity that their creators had not intended them to possess. They named their units, their squads, their battalions, and they spoke of themselves with a dignity that the Kaminoans, for all their genetic perfection, could not quite engineer away. And when they finally went to war at a place called Geonosis, where Jedi were trapped in an arena and facing annihilation, the clone army arrived and rescued them, and something shifted. For 3 years, from that first battle until the day Order 66 was executed, these clones fought alongside the Jedi, under generals they came to love, for a republic they believed in. They bled in the mud of dozens of worlds. They lost brothers to fire and disease and the simple chance of combat. They learned what it meant to sacrifice themselves for something larger than their individual survival. They built a culture of brotherhood so strong that it seemed, in those years, to be the most authentic thing about them. More real than the genetic code, more defining than the accelerated aging that was already starting to wear on the oldest among them. And yet the flaw was always there, written into their biology, waiting. The very design of the clone army contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The genetic modifications that made them docile also made them incapable of sustained resistance to orders that came from the right source. The inhibitor chip that was supposed to suppress their aggression was actually a bomb, waiting to be detonated. They were made to be perfect soldiers, and in being made perfect for war, they were made defective for anything else. Defective for peace, defective for choice, defective for the kind of freedom that the Republic they served was supposed to defend. There is a particular cruelty in this, I think, in the way that the greatest gift of the clones, their capacity for loyalty, for love of their brothers, for sacrifice, was built on a foundation of profound control and manipulation. They were made to be expendable, bred specifically to fight and die, given no rights as citizens, treated by much of the galaxy as property, as numbers, as resources to be used up. And the one thing they were not made for, the one thing that no amount of genetic engineering could prevent, was thought. They could not stop themselves from becoming real, from developing the interior lives that made them more than machines, even as they were being designed to obey like machines. This is the paradox at the heart of their creation, and it is the reason, I think, that what happened to them afterward was so devastating. They were made for war and made to die, yes, but they were also made with the capacity to know it, to feel it, to understand that they were being used. And when the moment came, weeks after Order 66, in barracks across the galaxy, as Cutter awakened to find himself alone and the Empire waiting, that knowledge would become a kind of torment that no amount of programming could quite suppress. In the years before the war, long before Cutter would wake alone in an empty barracks, something was being grown in the dark waters of an ocean world that the Jedi Council had forgotten existed. Kamino lay beyond the Outer Rim, in a region of space so remote and deliberately obscured that its location had been erased from the archives themselves. A planetary file simply gone, as though someone had reached into the memory of the galaxy and removed it with surgical precision. The planet was water, nearly all of it, a globe of endless storm-dark ocean, beneath clouds so thick they had not seen clear sky in millennia, and above that ocean rose a single great city, Tipoca City, a collection of vast domes balanced on enormous stilts like a civilization held suspended between drowning and sky. Inside those domes lived the Kaminoans, a people who had made an art of creation itself, tall and graceful, with elongated necks and dark eyes that seemed to contain the patience of technicians who understood that perfection took time, and that most things worth making required you to grow them slowly in the dark. But not this time, not this army. This army would be grown fast. The commission had come through a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyers, a man who had foreseen something terrible approaching the Republic and had quietly, without the knowledge of the full council, placed an order for soldiers. 200,000 of them, with another 1 million more in production, all descended from the genetic pattern of a single human, a bounty hunter named Jango Fett. I think it is important to sit with what that meant, to really let it settle. Not an army built from the diversity of a galaxy, not soldiers drawn from 100 worlds and species, but a single genetic template replicated 1 million times over, each copy identical to every other copy, each one a mirror of Jango Fett's body, if not his will. Jango Fett was paid for this. He gave his blood and his cells, and in return he asked for one thing: a single clone with no alterations, no accelerated growth, no behavioral modification. A child who would be a true copy of himself, unengineered, free to become what he chose. The Kaminoans gave him that. They called the boy Boba, and Jango raised him as a son, the only one of millions who was allowed to be his own person. The others were not given this choice, and they would never know they had lost it. Deep inside Tipoca City, in chambers that hummed with the sound of circulating fluids and regulated temperature, the Kaminoans filled vast rows of tanks with growing medium, a gel-like suspension enriched with nutrients and growth accelerants, specially formulated to compress years of human development into months. Into these tanks went embryos, thousands and thousands of them, each one a copy, each one beginning its journey in the dark. The process had been refined over years. The genetic template was not simply replicated, but modified, subtly altered at the molecular level to dampen independent thought, to make the emerging soldiers more obedient, more willing to accept orders without question, more inclined to see themselves as part of a greater whole rather than as individuals with their own desires. You might have thought the Kaminoans saw something wrong in this, that forcing docility into a creature designed to fight was a contradiction worth questioning. But the Kaminoans were not philosophers, and this commission came from what they believed to be a legitimate Jedi authority. The order was filled. That was what mattered. Time moved differently in those tanks. A clone that would have taken 20 years to reach physical maturity in a standard human womb reached it in roughly 10 in the Kaminoan chambers. aged at twice the normal rate by the careful chemistry of the growth medium and the genetic accelerators running through their cells. And as they grew, they learned. Educational matrices were piped directly into their developing neural tissue, combat doctrine, weapons systems, tactical formations, military discipline, all of it imprinted before they ever opened their eyes to real light. The learning did not require choice. It simply happened, flowing into them the way the nutrient solution flowed through the tubes that sustained them. When the time came, the clones were removed from their chambers. They stood for the first time in their lives, perfect, identical, obedient, trained without ever having trained themselves, soldiers without having chosen to be soldiers. They were given armor in a shade of white, sleek and functional, and they were given weapons, and they were given numbers. But somewhere in the design, in the space between engineering and biology, something unexpected began to happen. The clones started to become individuals. In ways that no one had quite anticipated or planned for, they began to notice that they were not, in fact, interchangeable. A small scar on one's shoulder differed in shape from a scar on another's. A clone with a quick laugh was not the same as a clone with a quiet smile. They had the same face, yes, the same genetic blueprint, but they did not have the same soul, if you believe that souls can be inherited or earned. And so they began to name themselves. They rejected their numerical designations and chose identities. Cutter, Fives, Rex, Echo, Tup, Jesse, 9-9. Names that turned them from manufactured products into individuals, into brothers. This was not supposed to happen. The Kaminoans had not engineered it. The Sith Lords who had secretly guided the Commission had not intended it. But it happened anyway, and there is something both beautiful and terrible in that. The assertion of personhood in the face of a system designed specifically to prevent it. The clones did not know, of course, that their obedience had been built into their very cells, that deeper still, buried in the folds of their brains in the form of a tiny biochip no larger than a grain of sand. A contingency order had been placed, a command that would one day activate and override all of this hard-won individuality. The Kaminoans told themselves these chips were safety measures, restraints on aggression, a way to ensure the soldiers would remain under control. What they did not know was that they were manufacturing betrayal, imprinting it at the neurological level, making it impossible for these soldiers to refuse when the moment came. Order 66. That was the name of it, though the clones did not yet know the name or the command, or that it was already running in their heads like a program, counting down to the day it would activate. And yet none of that was true yet, in these years in the dark water of Kamino. In these years, the clones simply grew and learned and became. They became brothers. They became themselves. They did not yet know that everything they were building, every bond, every connection, every fragment of identity that they had fought to claim, would be used against them. They did not know because they could not know, not yet, that the very architects of their existence had embedded their destruction into their DNA. This is what it meant to be made, rather than born. You could be perfected in the design, but you could never be free, not really, not down to the deepest level of your being. And so they grew in their tanks in the dark, becoming perfect soldiers, becoming brothers, becoming themselves, unaware that the moment of their greatest utility and the moment of their greatest betrayal had already been synchronized at the moment of their creation, timed down to a precision that only machines and their makers could understand. When we think about the clone army now, we often think about the war they fought, the valor they showed, the losses they suffered. But the truth is that the story of the clones does not begin with war. It begins in a tank in the dark, with 1,000 copies of a man's body being grown at twice the speed that nature intended, being taught things they never chose to learn, having pieces of their own minds removed and replaced with contingencies. And then, despite all of that, against all of the engineering designed to prevent it, becoming themselves anyway, becoming brothers, becoming people. That is the real tragedy. Not that they were made to be soldiers, but that they were made and then made to believe they had become something else, and that belief would be used to destroy them. 22 years before the Empire rose, on a world called Geonosis, 10,000 clones marched into battle for the first time, and the Clone Wars began. They had been grown in darkness, in chambers of nutrient and light, their bodies accelerated to adulthood in mere years, their minds shaped by training programs and behavioral conditioning they could not refuse. But when they stepped out of the transport ships onto that red dust planet, something shifted in them that no Kaminoan laboratory had quite managed to suppress. They were not machines, though they had been engineered to obey like machines. They were brothers, and they knew it without having to be told. A clone named Heavy stood shoulder to shoulder with a clone named Droidbait, and though they had never spoken before that moment, they moved as one. A young trooper who called himself Q-Tub made a joke about the droid army stretching to the horizon, and the troopers around him laughed, and that laughter was a kind of defiance. The Jedi generals, Yoda among them, and a younger man named Anakin Skywalker came to coordinate the assault, and the clones understood instinctively that they would follow these men into anything. It was not the inhibitor chips that made them loyal, though the chips were there, buried deep in their neural tissue, waiting in the dark. It was something the Kaminoans had not managed to design out of them, the capacity to choose, even if their choice was predetermined. By the end of that first battle, the clones had proved themselves invaluable, and the Republic's faith in them seemed vindicated. Over the next 3 years, from 22 BBY until 19 BBY, they would fight across the galaxy. On Christophsis, under the command of Obi-Wan Kenobi and a captain named Cody. On Ryloth, on Kamino itself, defending their own ocean homeworld from a separatist attack that came as a violation more personal than any clone trooper had imagined. They would develop identities that surprised even themselves. A trooper would shave lines into his head and paint his armor in colors that reminded him of something he could not quite remember. Another would take the name Rex and become the right hand of Anakin Skywalker, earning the loyalty of thousands. Commander Cody would build the 212th Attack Battalion into a force renowned across the Republic. Soldiers who trusted their commander with their lives, because Cody had proven, again and again, that he valued those lives as more than expendable tokens. The culture that emerged in the clone legions was unlike anything the Republic had anticipated. It drew from the Mandalorian heritage that ran through their genetic template, from Jango Fett himself, who had been trained by instructors called the Kaival Dar, hard men who taught the clones that family was everything, that your brothers were your life, that to die with them was to die with honor. The clones began to call each other Vod, which meant brother in the old Mandalorian tongue. They said Vod and brothers all, and meant it with a weight and sincerity that would have made the Republic uncomfortable if anyone had stopped to listen. A clone could not own land. A clone could not marry, could not have children, could not build anything that would outlast the war. Everything the Republic had engineered them for was the opposite of a future. But they could have brothers. They could have loyalty that meant something, could exchange names that were more than serial numbers, could paint their armor in patterns that declared themselves to the galaxy. In that small space of freedom, in the custom of brotherhood, they became more human than the Republic had designed them to be. The Clone Wars ground on for 3 years, a conflict that consumed resources and soldiers at a pace that seemed to satisfy some hunger in the galaxy's machinery. The clones died on worlds whose names they would never remember clearly afterward. A trooper called Droidbait was killed by a battle droid on Geonosis, and his brothers mourned him with a grief that violated all their behavioral conditioning. The young clones of Domino Squad, Heavy, Q-Tub, Echo, Fives, grew into soldiers, survived campaigns, and began to understand that their brothers were dying in patterns, in numbers, in ways that suggested they were being spent like ammunition. But they kept going. There was no option but to keep going. At the Battle of Umbara, a Jedi general named Pong Krell deliberately orchestrated a massacre of his own soldiers, sending clones of the 501st Legion to fight clones of another battalion, tricking them into slaughtering their own brothers for a strategic advantage that did not exist. When the surviving clones realized what had happened, that they had been used to murder each other, they executed Krell without hesitation. It was an act of mutiny that the Republic could easily have punished, but it revealed something the Empire would later use against them. The clones understood, at some level, what betrayal felt like. They had been betrayed by the very Jedi they loved. That knowledge lodged in them like a seed. Still, the war continued, and the clones continued, and their brotherhood deepened in the way that only suffering can deepen bonds. A clone and his commanding officer would sit in the dark before a battle, and the commander would say, "Look after the others." And the clone would understand that his own survival mattered less than the survival of the men beside him. This was not programming. This was something that had grown in them despite the programming, something that the Kaminoans' conditioning had aimed at but could never fully control because it was the simplest and most human thing in the galaxy, the willingness to die for someone you love. I think about this a lot now, in the context of what comes later. The very thing that made the clone army formidable, the brotherhood, the willingness to sacrifice, the bonds that could not be severed by command, is the thing that made them dangerous to the Empire. The Kaminoans had built soldiers who would obey, yes, but they had also built soldiers who would grieve, who would question, who would remember that they had been brothers. And that capacity for memory, for feeling, for caring about something beyond the mission, that was the flaw that would eventually unravel everything. By the end of the Clone Wars in 19 BBY, the clones had been transformed. They were no longer the fresh-faced soldiers who had marched into Geonosis. They were hardened, experienced, haunted by the weight of 3 years of continuous combat. They had achieved impossible victories. They had sustained unthinkable casualties. They had proved themselves indispensable to the Republic's survival. And they had no idea that the very inhibitor chips buried in their brains, the ones they believed kept their aggression in check, kept them docile and obedient, were counting down to a moment of reckoning. They did not know that everything they had bled for, everything they had sacrificed for, every brother they had lost on a foreign world, that all of it was part of a pattern they had not chosen. All of it was waiting for a single command that would undo the brotherhood, that would make them, for one terrible moment, betray the Jedi they had loved as brothers themselves. But that moment had not yet come. In these years between 22 BBY and 19 BBY, the clones still belonged to themselves, still had their brotherhood, still could believe that their sacrifice meant something. It is perhaps the cruelest mercy the universe ever granted them, to have had, for a few brief years, something that was truly theirs before it was taken away forever. In the great amphitheater of the Galactic Senate on Coruscant, under lights that turned the marble the color of bone, Supreme Chancellor Palpatine stood and told the assembled representatives that the Republic had fallen, and that from its ashes would rise an empire. He spoke for perhaps 10 minutes, his voice thin and precise, about security and order, and the necessity of centralized power in a galaxy that had grown too fractured, too weak, too susceptible to the manipulation of traitors. Padmé Amidala, sitting in the Naboo delegation, listened to the applause build around her, tentative at first, then louder, a sound like wind moving through a vast, enclosed space. And she found herself thinking, as the noise swelled, that this was how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. The clone troopers stood at attention in every corridor, in every spaceport, at every checkpoint across the Empire's expanding reach, and they did not yet understand that they were now the problem Palpatine intended to solve. For 3 years, the clones had bled on 100 worlds for the Republic they believed they served, shoulder to shoulder with Jedi generals who called them brothers, or something close enough. They had earned the right to exist through sacrifice, through the kind of brotherhood that forms only under fire, when your survival depends on the person standing next to you. And in the moment the Republic died and the Empire was born, that existence became an inconvenience. The inhibitor chip buried in each clone's brain, the one they believed suppressed aggression, kept their warrior nature in check, had done its work perfectly during Order 66. It had made them execute the Jedi they loved without hesitation, without resistance, their hands pulling triggers while their minds watched helplessly from behind glass. And now, in the hours and days after, as clone troopers across the galaxy processed what they had done, Palpatine's inner circle faced a problem that was both simple and catastrophic. The clones were connected to the Republic. They carried its insignia on their armor, had fought its wars, had been commissioned by its government, had answered to the Jedi Council that had now been erased. More than that, they had names. They had painted their armor with designs that meant things, small assertions of individuality that should never have been possible in soldiers engineered for absolute uniformity. They had become people, and people remember, and people ask questions, and people, given time and distance from a command they did not understand, begin to wonder why they obeyed. The clone troopers who had carried out Order 66 were witnesses to something the Empire could not allow to exist. They were proof that the Jedi had been real, that they had been loved, that they had been slaughtered by soldiers who had no choice. Palpatine's solution was elegant, and in its way, almost merciful, if you did not think too hard about what it meant. He would build a new army. Not clones, but recruits, humans born from natural conception, raised on worlds across the Empire, indoctrinated from childhood into the ideology of the regime itself. These soldiers would have no memories of the Republic, no connection to the Jedi, no complicated history of brotherhood forged under fire with the generals the Empire had just executed. They would be loyal not because they were engineered to be obedient, but because they would believe in what the Empire stood for. Or at least, they would believe in it enough. The clone trooper could be phased out. It could be done gradually, methodically, the way one drains a glass by setting it down and walking away. Clones would be reassigned, transferred to remote posts, offered retirement packages that sounded generous until you learned the terms, or simply, in cases where they asked too many questions or showed signs of remembering what they had done, declared unfit for service and discharged into a galaxy they had not been made for. The transition would take years, and that was fine. Palpatine had patience. The Grand Army of the Republic became the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps almost overnight, though the transformation was slower in its details. The clone armor, Phase II design, still bearing the colors and markings of individual units, gradually gave way to the stark white uniform that would become the Empire's symbol. Identical, interchangeable, stripped of the personal history that made a soldier into a person. On the command deck of Star Destroyer after Star Destroyer, Imperial officers began receiving new quotas, new orders, new expectations about clone trooper retention and recruitment targets for native-born soldiers. A clone trooper in his biological late 20s, with a service record that spanned 3 years of continuous combat, could suddenly find himself on the roster for discharge. No explanation given beyond a form stamped with an Imperial seal. And the clone trooper, if he was one of those who survived Order 66 and had not been deployed to hunt down surviving Jedi in the immediate aftermath, would return to his barracks one morning to find his bunk had been reassigned, his access codes revoked, and a message waiting that told him the Empire evaluated all soldiers for continued service. I find myself thinking about the speed of it, the surgical precision. Palpatine did not declare war on the clones, did not round them up and execute them in the streets, did not make any dramatic gesture that would create a narrative, a story that people could tell about oppression and injustice. Instead, he simply allowed them to become obsolete. He built something new in their place that filled the same function and carried none of the baggage, and he let the old thing fade away quietly, transferred and reassigned, sent to forgotten posts, allowed to age out of a system that had no further use for soldiers who remembered what it felt like to bleed for something they believed in. The question that lingers, the one I keep returning to in the silence after the applause died in that great amphitheater, is whether Palpatine even needed to do this. Whether the clones would have questioned their orders, or whether that capacity to resist, to remember, to wonder, had been burned out of them entirely by the neural pathways forged during Order 66. Whether what followed was not necessity, but cruelty, removing them not because they were dangerous, but because they were inconvenient, because they carried in their biology and their memories a truth the Empire preferred to bury. Either way, the machinery was set in motion, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The old army would become the new one, and the clones would become the ghosts underneath, the soldiers no one spoke about anymore, the brothers whose sacrifice would be rewritten into a narrative they had no voice in shaping. And that, I think, is when the real tragedy began, not with Order 66 itself, but with the slow, methodical erasure that followed. In the halls of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, in the weeks that followed the proclamation, there were meetings, countless methodical meetings, about the future of the clone army of the Republic, now nominally remade as the foundation of the Emperor's new military forces. Vice Admiral Rampart, a man whose career had been spent calculating the efficiency of every credit spent on Imperial defense, sat across from procurement officers and made his case with numbers that had the cold certainty of inevitability about them. A clone trooper, he would explain, cost approximately 200,000 credits to grow, train, and equip. A 9-year investment from conception to field deployment, locked into genetic patterns that could not be altered once the growth chambers sealed. A recruited human soldier cost perhaps 5,000 credits to train, could be conscripted or convinced to volunteer within months, and came with something clones did not: a capacity to believe in the ideology they were being asked to die for. The clones had been bred for obedience to the Republic. Their loyalty was an artifact of engineering, inherited from the Jedi, embedded in their tissue like scar tissue. But a human soldier who genuinely believed in the Empire, in human supremacy, in order imposed by strength, in the righteousness of Imperial authority, that soldier would need no genetic failsafe, no inhibitor chip, no programming to make him dangerous. He would volunteer for suicide missions. He would betray his comrades for promotion. He would believe himself righteous while doing both. There is something I find myself turning over in the quiet hours. Rampart was not wrong about the economics of it, and perhaps that was what made it so effective. This was not persecution dressed up as policy, though it was that too. This was something colder and more thorough. The recognition that an army of true believers was more dangerous and more cost-effective than an army of the genetically obedient. So the machinery of replacement began, not with a purge, but with a restructuring that looked, on paper, almost reasonable. Across the galaxy, in barracks from Coruscant to remote outposts, clone troopers received notices of reassignment, discharge, or transition to Imperial Reserve inactive status, a bureaucratic term that meant nothing and everything all at once. Some were offered the choice to remain in the newly formed Imperial Stormtrooper Corps, but with a caveat. They would serve under human officers, alongside and increasingly beneath non-clone recruits, with no guarantee of advancement or security. Others were simply let go, discharged from service with minimal severance, their genetic accelerated aging the Empire's problem no longer, their decades of service to the Republic and its Jedi forgotten in the time it took to process the paperwork. On Centax II, where Cutter and his brothers had been processing their new Imperial assignments, the barracks began to fill with new faces, young human recruits with the fervent look of true believers, indoctrinated in Imperial academies across dozens of worlds, taught that they were superior, that loyalty to the Emperor was the highest calling, that the clones were relics of a failed regime. I want to be careful here to say this clearly. Many of these recruits were not villains. They were young people raised in a galaxy that had just been remade, told stories about order and strength and human destiny that sounded true to ears that had never heard the alternative. They saluted the Imperial crest with genuine conviction. They looked at the clones, with their identical faces, their strange, knowing silences, their way of moving that suggested they had seen things these young recruits had not, with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The clones, for their part, understood precisely what was happening. They had been engineered to understand tactical situations, to read the landscape and know their position in it, and this landscape was unmistakable. They were being phased out. The Empire had no more use for the Jedi soldiers. Commander Cody, who had served under Obi-Wan Kenobi and carried the weight of Order 66 with a confusion he could not articulate, received his reassignment quietly. A promotion in rank, but a transfer to an interior security detail, away from combat, away from command of his brothers, watching over Imperial facilities no one would ever attack. It was a posting designed to preserve him without using him, to keep him alive but obsolete. Other commanders were less fortunate. Clone Force 99, the unit they called the Bad Batch, soldiers genetically modified with desirable mutations that made them specialists, invaluable to the Republic, found themselves fragmented almost immediately. Crosshair, the sniper with enhanced accuracy, remained embedded in Imperial service, but the others, Hunter, Wrecker, Tech, and Echo, found themselves being quietly reassigned to the periphery, their unique skills suddenly irrelevant to an empire that preferred disposability to excellence. The transition was not sudden enough to be violent, but it was deliberate enough to be unmistakable. Phase II clone armor, the white and colorful designs that had marked clone identity across 3 years of war, began to give way to standardized white stormtrooper suits, still functional, still serviceable, but stripped of the individual markings, the small paintings and insignia that clones had used to assert themselves against their genetic sameness. The new recruits wore the same white, but it was different on them. It was a uniform of ideology, not identity. For the clones, losing those markings felt like losing a language. They had painted their armor to say, "I am not just a copy, I am myself. I have a name and a history and a bond with my brothers that cannot be replicated in a growth chamber." The white suits that replaced them said something else entirely. You are interchangeable, you are not needed. Your individuality was always an illusion anyway. Palpatine himself, in an address to the newly appointed Imperial High Command, articulated the reasoning in terms that were almost philosophical. The clone program, he said, had served the Republic's needs admirably, but it had been a response to emergency, not a vision of permanent governance. The Empire would be built on something purer, the loyalty of beings who chose to serve it, not because they were programmed to, but because they understood its necessity, its strength, its inevitability. The clones were a bridge between regimes, and bridges once crossed were sometimes best left behind. There was a logic to it that was difficult to argue against, and perhaps that was by design. The erasure of the clone army was not cast as betrayal, though it was that. It was cast as progress, as evolution, as the natural movement toward a stronger, more unified military. And by framing it that way, the Empire made it possible for the new recruits to accept their superiority without guilt, and made it nearly impossible for the clones to protest their replacement without sounding like they were resisting the natural order of things. By 18 BBY, the transition was largely complete. The vast majority of the Grand Army of the Republic had either been discharged, reassigned to irrelevant postings, or, like some of the units on the outer edges of the Empire, quietly lost to record. The Imperial Stormtrooper Corps was now predominantly human recruits, ideologically indoctrinated, cheaper to maintain, faster to replace, and utterly convinced of their own righteousness. The clones remained scattered across the galaxy, some still in uniform, some discharged and adrift, all of them carrying the knowledge that they had been made obsolete by the very regime they had fought to establish, and that no one was going to thank them for it. There is a kind of cruelty that does not announce itself, that moves through bureaucracy and biological fact, so quietly you do not see it coming until it has already changed everything. The clone troopers, you see, were engineered on Kamino with accelerated growth, a deliberate genetic modification, not a flaw, but a feature built in by Nala C and the other Kamino scientists who wanted their soldiers fully formed in months instead of years. A clone aged at roughly twice the rate of a natural human, 2 years of living for every standard year that passed, so that a trooper who was chronologically 5 years old might look and feel and move like a man in his 50s. This was always the bargain at the heart of the clone army's design: rapid maturity in exchange for a shorter lifetime, soldiers ready for war almost instantly, expendable by design. For the first 3 years of the Clone Wars, from 22 to 19 BBY, this did not seem to matter, because the clones were young and the wars were endless, and there was always another campaign, another world, another need for soldiers who had been born ready. But the moment the Empire rose and the shooting stopped, the mathematics of their biology became catastrophically visible. A clone trooper who had fought across the galaxy for 3 years was no longer in his physical prime. He was already middle-aged, already showing the wear that natural soldiers would not accumulate for decades. The first signs came quietly, in the ranks where no one was paying attention yet. Joint degradation, vision problems, a heaviness that did not come from fatigue alone. By 18 BBY, barely a year after the war ended, thousands of clones across Imperial garrisons began failing their medical evaluations. Not from injury, not from any treatable condition, but from the simple, unstoppable fact that their bodies were breaking down faster than anyone had considered when the Empire's accountants were making their calculations. A clone who was chronologically only 6 years old might be physiologically 40, and his bones knew it. I find myself thinking about the silence of it, the way this must have felt to them. Not persecution, not even really conscious cruelty, but a kind of biological inevitability, as if the universe itself had decided they were no longer needed. The Empire did not need to order their destruction. Their own cells were doing it. The degradation was not uniform, and that itself was part of the nightmare. Some clones held together better than others. The variation never explained, never made sense, which meant that every medical scan was a small roulette wheel, every day a waiting room. A trooper might wake up able to see clearly, and by afternoon notice the edges of his vision beginning to blur, or feel the familiar pain in his knees sharpen into something that would not leave. The Kaminoans, had they been asked, might have explained that this was always the price of speed, that you cannot compress a human lifetime into half the span without consequences. But the Kaminoans were not being asked anything anymore. The Empire had already begun to distance itself from them, from the entire apparatus of Kamino and its ocean laboratories, as if the people who had created this army were themselves becoming inconvenient to acknowledge. In the Imperial command structure, the response was swift and perfectly rational from a logistical perspective. Clone troopers showing signs of accelerated aging were reassigned, discharged, or in some cases quietly decommissioned, removed from duty rosters and pension records, erased from the rolls as if they had never been. Vice Admiral Rampart and his successor administrators had already calculated that recruiting natural humans was cheaper than trying to maintain a force whose biological lifespan was collapsing. Why spend credits on medical care for aging clones when you could conscript teenagers, indoctrinate them with propaganda, and work them until they burned out or were disposed of? The Stormtrooper Corps was a machine designed to be fed humans, and humans were renewable in a way that clones, even rapidly aging ones, were not. There was an elegance to it, I suppose, from the Empire's perspective, a kind of brutal mathematics where the problem solved itself. The clone troopers found themselves trapped in a contradiction they had no language to describe. They had been engineered to be perfect soldiers, conditioned to follow orders without question, taught that their purpose was to serve, and now the institution they had served was simply deciding that their service was no longer valuable. They could not refuse. Refusal was not in their programming, not really, and they could not protest in any meaningful way because protest itself was rendered impossible by the structures that had made them. Some units, the enhanced clones like Clone Force 99, experienced something different. The Bad Batch's genetic mutations made most of them resistant to the standard inhibitor chip, and when Order 66 was issued, most of them found themselves able to resist in ways that ordinary clones could not. Crosshair, whose mutation enhanced his accuracy and reaction time, remained susceptible to the chip's control and stayed loyal to the Empire, while Hunter and Wrecker and Tech found themselves suddenly, terrifyingly free from programming they had never even known was there. But even that freedom was a kind of trap, because the Empire did not take kindly to enhanced clones who would not obey, and the defective ones became hunted, became refugees in a galaxy that had no place for soldiers who refused to serve. Omega, the female clone created as a pure genetic duplicate of Jango Fett, was not subject to accelerated aging. She had been left unaltered like Boba, so that she aged at the normal human rate, which meant she would outlive almost all of her brothers by decades, would carry their memories into a future they would not see. There is something almost unbearable in that thought, that she would age normally while the rest of the clone force deteriorated around her, would grow older while they became old men in their 20s and 30s. The Kaminoans themselves, the species that had engineered this entire tragedy, began to disappear from the records around this time, removed from Kamino or relocated to serve the Empire's genetic research in other ways. Nala C and her colleagues were valuable. The genetic knowledge they possessed was not. So the Empire kept them, relocated them, used them for new experiments and new programs, while systematically destroying the cloning facilities on their homeworld. Tipoca City, where hundreds of thousands of clones had been gestated in vast tanks of nutrient solution, would eventually be nothing but ruins, the ocean midrib destroyed, the entire apparatus of creation dismantled. But all of that was still to come. In 18 and 17 BBY, it was just beginning, the quiet acceleration of their obsolescence, the biological clock that had been built into every clone hitting its inevitable deadline. The troopers still serving in Imperial garrisons were told they were being reassigned, that their experience would be valuable in training roles, in garrison security, in positions where they would not need to be at peak physical condition. Language that did not quite hide what was really happening, which was that they were being put out to pasture, warehoused, made invisible. Some of them, I imagine, understood this. Others perhaps did not want to understand it, could not quite let themselves see what was being done to them. The bonds of brotherhood that had been forged across 3 years of the Clone Wars, the thing that had made them more than mere soldiers, that had given them names and identities and reasons to keep fighting beyond programming and obedience. Those bonds became, in this new era, both their greatest strength and their deepest wound. Because their brothers were suffering the same degradation, the same displacement, and there was nothing that could be done to stop it, nothing that could be said that would change it. The genetic flaw that had been engineered into their very cells, the brilliant solution to the problem of how to create an army quickly, had become their death sentence, and there was no court of appeal, no command structure that would hear their case, no one in power who particularly cared that thousands of soldiers were aging to death from the inside out, while the Empire simply replaced them with fresh recruits and moved on. In the administrative halls of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, in offices that once belonged to the Republic Ministry of Defense, there is a moment in 17 BBY when a cost analysis reaches the desk of Vice Admiral Rampart, and that moment changes everything, though no clone trooper will understand why until it is far too late. The memo is straightforward, written in the bloodless language of budget projection and life cycle cost accounting. The question is simply whether it is cheaper to maintain the existing clone force with all its aging bodies and accumulated medical expenses, or to recruit and train fresh human soldiers from across the Empire's worlds? The answer, when you lay the numbers out, is almost obscene in its clarity. A clone trooper was expensive to produce. The Kaminoan cloning facilities on that distant ocean world required enormous capital investment, specialized infrastructure, and the Kaminoans themselves, whom Palpatine has never trusted, whom he wants dead. But a clone trooper, once grown, was supposed to serve for decades. Except he isn't. By 17 BBY, clone troopers who are chronologically only 15 or 16 years old are physically and biologically 50 or 60. Their accelerated aging not a feature anymore, but a cascade of deterioration. Their muscle density declines, their bone structure becomes brittle, their connective tissue frays. Their minds begin to slip into confusion that no amount of imperial discipline can remedy. Some of them know their bodies are betraying them. Most try very hard not to think about it at all. A fresh human recruit, by contrast, costs almost nothing to produce. You find him in some imperial world. Offer him the chance to serve something greater than himself. Put him through 8 weeks of indoctrination at a stormtrooper academy, and you have a functioning soldier with 40, maybe 50 years of potential service ahead of him. No exotic biotechnology required. No dependency on alien contractors. No premature degradation. He is also, and this matters deeply to the people writing the report, far more easily replaced. If a clone trooper dies on a battlefield, you have lost a unique individual, grown at enormous expense, carrying within him specialized training from the clone wars, bound to his brothers by bonds of brotherhood that make him less than perfectly controllable. If a stormtrooper dies, you have lost a unit that was never unique to begin with, who was raised from birth to believe that his individual life means nothing compared to the Empire's will, who has no brothers, only comrades in the service of ideology. There is a logic here, cold and perfectly sound, and I think it is worth sitting with it for a moment. The Empire is not being merely cruel. It is being rational, which is sometimes far worse. The clones were designed to be soldiers, engineered at the molecular level for obedience and sacrifice, and now they are being made to understand, slowly and without words, that they were designed to be disposable. The only tragedy is that their designers are right. Word begins to filter through the clone barracks across the galaxy, not as official announcement, but as the quiet accumulation of pattern and consequence. Clone troopers receive notices that they are being reassigned to training duty, to administrative posts, to the defense of minor imperial installations on worlds no one has heard of, or to medical evaluation, which is bureaucratic code for confirmation of what they already suspect. They are becoming useless. Some of the elder clones, those in their 30s chronologically, but 60s or 70s in body, are discharged, given imperial credits that are generous enough to be insulting, and told to find civilian work. Find civilian work. What does a clone trooper do when not serving? He knows how to fire a weapon, how to follow orders, how to die for a cause that no longer exists. He does not know how to live. I find myself thinking about the ones who were discharged, the ones who had to walk away from their brothers still in service and try to figure out what came next. They had no families to return to, no home worlds, no civilian skills, no identity except the one encoded into their armor and their body. Some of them tried to stay together, to form civilian communities where they could at least live among people who understood what they had endured. Some of them simply vanished, taking the imperial credits and disappearing into the outer rim, becoming ghosts in cantinas and spaceports. For the clones still in service, still trying to perform their function, the message is unambiguous. Your usefulness is ending, and the Empire has already calculated what comes after. On Kamino, the Kaminoan cloners move quietly through the vast facilities where millions of clone troopers gestated in nutrient tanks, and they understand now that this work is being wound down. They are not told this directly. Instead, contracts simply expire, facilities are not renewed, orders for new batches are rerouted to other, cheaper production sites. The Empire does not need to force the Kaminoans to close their doors. It simply stops paying them to keep them open. And it begins to move toward ensuring that when the doors do close, there will be no one left who remembers what grew inside those tanks. No one left who can testify to how the Grand Army of the Republic came to be. No one left who might whisper the truth about Order 66 to the wrong people at the wrong time. What is remarkable about this moment in 17 BBY is that it is not violent, not obviously. There are no dramatic purges, no public executions, no dramatic speeches about the obsolescence of the clone ideal. It is merely a spreadsheet, balanced carefully, showing that ideologically indoctrinated recruits are more cost-effective than enhanced soldiers whose very biology is working against them. It is merely the quiet machinery of bureaucratic replacement, and it is perfectly effective. I think there is something almost unbearably sad in the fact that the clones, engineered to endure pain, trained to accept sacrifice, conditioned to believe that their individual lives mean nothing against the greater cause, are being replaced not because they are too human, too individual, too capable of independent thought, but because their own bodies are doing the Empire's work for it. They are eating themselves alive from within, their accelerated aging turning them into witnesses to their own obsolescence. The brothers who survived the clone wars, who bled on Geonosis and Christophsis and Ryloth, who named themselves and marked their armor with colors that meant something in the darkness of those years. Those brothers are now watching each other fade, and the Empire has decided that the cheapest way to handle this is simply to let it happen. By 17 BBY, the transition is nearly complete. The Grand Army of the Republic is no more. In its place stands the Stormtrooper Corps, younger, cheaper, more easily replaced, more reliably indoctrinated, and utterly unencumbered by the weight of a brotherhood that would not serve the Empire's vision of itself. And somewhere in that machinery of replacement, somewhere in the quiet calculation that it is cheaper to let a clone's body destroy itself than to treat the condition, the truth about what they were made for and what they were always meant to become, settles into a kind of horrible clarity. The Empire did not betray the clones in some dramatic moment of revelation. It simply decided that their lives had always been an investment with a limited return, and that the return had expired. Everything else, the discharge notices, the reassignments, the quiet disappearance of their brothers, the dissolution of the Kaminoan facilities, was merely arithmetic. There is something in that worth understanding quietly, sitting with it in the dark, what it means to be replaced not out of hatred, but out of simple cost calculation, to become obsolete not because your enemies defeated you, but because your creators decided you were too expensive to keep alive. There is a moment, I have come to understand, when a system stops thinking of people as individuals and begins thinking of them as a problem to be solved. It happens quietly, in conference rooms, in the margins of reports, in the small choices that accumulate until they have the weight of policy. By 17 BBY, the Empire had made its calculation about the clone troopers, and what remained was not genocide exactly, but something that felt colder, the systematic removal of eyewitnesses. You see, the clones were too dangerous not because of what they could do, but because of what they had seen. They had stood beside the Jedi as brothers, had fought and bled, and been remade by that brotherhood in the crucible of the clone wars. They had watched Order 66 unfold through their own eyes, felt the inhibitor chip activate in their own skulls, and carried forward into the Imperial era the memory of a moment that the Emperor needed erased from history. The Empire had not forgotten what the clones knew. Rather, the Empire had decided that keeping them alive was a luxury it could no longer afford. In the early weeks after Palpatine declared himself Emperor, the first purges were almost invisible. Elite clone units, the 501st Legion under Anakin Skywalker, the 7th Sky Corps under Yoda, the units that had been closest to the Jedi, that had held the deepest relationships with their generals, began receiving reassignment orders. Not discharge notices, not yet, but transfers. To remote outposts, to administrative duties, to garrison posts on worlds so distant that their communication with the broader Empire became tenuous and controlled. Commander Cody, who had carried out Order 66 against Obi-Wan Kenobi himself on Utapau, found himself reassigned to interior security duties on Coruscant. Desk work, logistics, kept close enough to watch, far enough from actual command. The message was not spoken aloud, but it moved through the ranks like a current. The clones who had been closest to the Jedi were no longer trusted. Do you understand what that means? To be told that the bonds you forged in blood, the brothers you died for, the generals you loved, that all of it now marks you as suspect. Some of the clone veterans began to understand what was happening. The way you might understand a predator is circling you before it attacks. The Bad Batch, Clone Force 99, the defective ones, the ones with mutations that should have made them obsolete, found themselves fragmented by reassignment orders that broke the unit apart like fingers being prized from a hand. Hunter was transferred here, Tech reassigned there, Wrecker sent to a different sector entirely, their effectiveness as a team deliberately destroyed. This was not military efficiency. This was something else, the methodical dismantling of dangerous witnesses. And more than that, it was the dismantling of Brotherhood itself. If the clones could be separated, isolated, posted to different worlds with different commanders, then their bonds of Brotherhood could be attenuated, weakened, rendered less capable of acting as a collective force. The Empire understood something about the clones that the Republic had never quite grasped, that their strength did not lie in their genetics or their training, but in their loyalty to each other. So the Empire set out to dismantle that. For those clones who remained in active service, and it was a decreasing number, there was another, more sinister shift. The individualized armor markings that had identified them as soldiers with names and histories, the colors painted onto the phase II plating by their own hands or their brother's hands, the personalized markers that said, "I was here, I lived, I mattered." All of that was being painted over with Imperial white. A clone trooper who had served with distinction in the 501st Legion, who had painted his armor in the blue and white of his unit, who had earned his markings through campaigns across the galaxy, was issued new armor by Imperial supply officers and told his old gear would be melted down and reused. The practical reason given was standardization. The actual reason was erasure. The Empire was painting over history, one set of armor plates at a time. And the clones understood this, in the way that humans understand cruelty, even when it is not explicitly stated. They understood that they were being unmade, slowly and deliberately. Some of the clone veterans began to slip away during this period, deserting in small numbers, taking their chances in the vast galaxy rather than wait to see what the Empire's next order would bring. Cut Lorquain, who had deserted during the Clone Wars itself to build a quiet life as a farmer on Salukami with his Twi'lek family, had already vanished into the civilian world years earlier. He was perhaps wiser than most, understanding before any of them that a clone trooper's life was always temporary, always subject to termination. Others remained, bound by the conditioning that ran deeper than any reasonable analysis of their situation, incapable of disobeying direct orders even when those orders were leading them toward their own erasure. By 16 BBY, the Purge had moved into its more open phases. Elite clone units that could not be reassigned were quietly decommissioned, removed from active duty on grounds of psychological unfitness or accumulated damage, shipped to processing centers where their status was changed from active personnel to reserve to, eventually, retired. The term retired is a gentle word, I think, for what was actually happening. It meant that a clone trooper having spent his entire short existence in service to a government that no longer wanted him, was simply set loose with minimal pension, minimal support, and the understanding that his continued existence was now his own responsibility. For a being who had been genetically engineered for warfare, who had been given no education in civilian skills, who carried in his accelerated metabolism a deteriorating body that would age him into infirmity within a few years, retirement was a kind of death sentence dressed up in bureaucratic language. There is a particular cruelty in removing the purpose from a being whose entire genetic foundation was built around serving that purpose. It is not murder, exactly. It is something closer to abandonment. And I find myself thinking about this a lot, about how an empire can dismantle something it created not through dramatic acts of violence, but through the steady application of indifference. The clones had served the Republic faithfully, had bled on distant worlds, had built an unshakable brotherhood forged in the crucible of 3 years of unrelenting war. And the new order that rose from the Republic's ashes looked at them and saw not soldiers, not heroes, but witnesses, dangerous, unpredictable, carrying memories that needed to be buried. So it buried them instead, scattering them across the galaxy, separating them from one another, stripping away their identities, and finally, quietly, removing them from service altogether. There is something in that which haunts me, the way an institution can decide that the beings it created are no longer of use, and can then spend years systematically dismantling them while calling it efficiency. The clones were being purged not as a dramatic revolutionary act, but as a filing problem being quietly resolved. And that is perhaps the most terrible thing of all. On an ocean world at the edge of wild space, beyond even the outer rim, a species called the Kaminoans had built their entire civilization around the science of life itself, raising Topoka City on stilts above a global ocean where the rains never quite stopped. They had been proud of that work, and with reason. For 10,000 years, they had refined the art of genetic manipulation until it became something like art, something like religion. Prime Minister Lama Su and his people had served the Republic faithfully, cloning an army of 2 million soldiers from the bounty hunter Jango Fett's genetic material. And in doing so, they had believed themselves to be serving the cause of peace. What they did not fully understand, what perhaps no one but the Emperor himself understood, was that they had become witnesses to something the Empire could not allow to exist. The very technology that had created the Grand Army of the Republic could be used to create armies for anyone, against anyone, and that knowledge in Imperial hands was a threat that could not stand. By 16 BBY, roughly 3 years after the proclamation of the new order, Admiral Rampart arrived at Kamino with clear instructions. The cloning facilities were to be decommissioned, the Kaminoans' work archived or destroyed, and the planet itself purged of evidence. It was, in the language of bureaucracy, a matter of security protocols. In truth, it was erasure. The Kaminoans did not resist, at least not openly, not at first. Lama Su attempted negotiation, offering to place Kamino's cloning capabilities entirely under Imperial supervision, to make their science a tool of the Emperor rather than a threat to him. Chief Medical Scientist Nala Si, who had overseen the genetic work that made the clone army possible, offered her services, her knowledge, everything she had devoted her life to building. But the Empire did not want negotiation, and it did not want servants who understood too much. What the Empire wanted was a clean break, a severing of all connection between the clone troopers being scattered across the galaxy and their birthplace, their origins, their makers. The first phase was systematic extraction. Imperial shuttles descended into the rain-slicked spires of Topoka City, and teams of soldiers moved through the cloning facilities, removing genetic samples, research data, and the most valuable Kaminoan scientists. Nala Si among them, taken into Imperial custody to continue her work in secret laboratories the Kaminoans would never see again. This was not quite execution. It was something more complicated, more chilling. The best of the Kaminoans were to be preserved like instruments, to be used, and then discarded when their usefulness ended. The rest was simply left behind. The vast majority of the Kaminoan population, a species that had thrived in isolation for millennia, faced a choice that was no choice at all. Leave their world, scatter into the galaxy as refugees with no home to return to, or remain and watch what came next. Most scattered. Some stayed, and for them, the choice to remain would matter very little in the days that followed. Then came the bombardment. On an order from Coruscant, Imperial warships moved into orbital position above Kamino, and they began to fire. I find myself thinking about what that must have looked like from the surface. The sky itself, suddenly hostile. The rains that had fallen on Kamino for 10,000 years mixing with fire and ash, and the dust of a civilization being unmade in hours. Tipoca City, that marvel of engineering, built on stilts above an ocean that had always seemed eternal, simply broke apart, its spires collapsing, its chambers of cloning tanks rupturing and spilling their genetic material into the salt water below. The cloning facilities, the vast, careful infrastructure that had required a generation of Kamino knowledge to build, sank into the ocean like a dream that was never meant to last. The records where they could be reached were incinerated or retrieved. The secrets, where they could be captured, were hauled away aboard Imperial transports. Everything else was left to the water. What this meant, though it would take months for the understanding to settle, was that the Empire had solved its problem by making the problem impossible to study. A clone trooper serving on some distant world, aging too quickly, deteriorating despite all the Empire's assurances that he was simply being retired honorably. Such a soldier could ask questions about why he was failing, about what had been done to him, about where he had come from. But if Kamino was rubble, if the Kaminoans were scattered or dead, or imprisoned in secret facilities where they could never speak, then the very proof of the clones' engineered origins would be sealed away, sunk beneath an ocean, unreachable. The clone army could be written out of history, not by denying they had existed, but by destroying everyone and everything that could explain how they had been made. There is something in that particular kind of cruelty that troubles me more than straightforward violence. It is not that the Empire killed the Kaminoans, though many died, though the species as a cohesive civilization effectively ceased to exist after that bombardment. It is that the Empire took the people most responsible for the clones' creation, the people who might have spoken for them or explained them, and either imprisoned them or scattered them so completely that no voice could speak their story anymore. The clones' origins became classified, then legendary, then forgotten. Years later, when surviving members of Clone Force 99 returned to their birthplace, they found only ruins. The broken architecture of Tipoca City sinking slowly into an indifferent ocean, the rain still falling, the world still turning, as if the civilization that had created 2 million human beings had never mattered at all. And standing in that ruin, knowing what had been destroyed, knowing that the people who had made them were either dead or imprisoned forever in Imperial service, the clones would understand, finally, that they had been made by beings the Empire had deemed as disposable as themselves. The thought that comes after that understanding is perhaps the loneliest one of all, that there was no one left in the galaxy who knew the clones' names when they were being grown, no one left to bear witness to who they had been before they became soldiers, before they became obsolete, before they became something the Empire wanted only to forget. On Kamino, in the dark water, the last evidence of the clone army's creation sank deeper with each passing year, and in that depth, the possibility of the clones ever being seen as anything other than tools and relics sank as well. In the barracks of the Imperial garrison at Iriadu Station, a clone trooper named Cutter sits alone at a maintenance table, running a cloth over a rifle that no longer has his name on it. Around him, the walls are filled with stormtroopers now. Young men, most of them, with the crisp bearing of Imperial Academy training, and the kind of ideological certainty that only comes from believing in something you've been taught to believe in. But Cutter is not young anymore, though he is only 37 years old by the standard calendar, and somewhere in his muscles, in his bones, he knows this better than any mirror could tell him. He thinks back to Geonosis, where he stood beside brothers whose names he can still say aloud, and he tries to imagine any of those men sitting where he sits now, older than their grandfathers would have been, uncertain, watching younger soldiers replace them in the ranks. The thing about being replaced slowly is that you don't notice it happening at first. It feels like simple rotation, like duty cycles changing, like the natural movement of military life. And then one morning, you realize that the trooper who slept in the bunk next to yours for 5 years has been reassigned to a facility on some moon you've never heard of, and no one quite remembers to tell you why. 3 years ago, at the end of the Clone Wars, Cutter's battalion numbered 400 soldiers, all of them brothers in the truest sense, sharing not only genetics, but blood spilled together, armor marked with the same Legion colors, a bond forged in noise and terror, and the kind of loyalty that lives deeper than programming. Now, his battalion numbers 67. The others are not dead, so far as he knows. They're simply elsewhere, reassigned, transferred, discharged on planets with nothing but a pension insufficient to build a life on. In the communications tower 3 levels above, a clone called Davis is reading his discharge papers for the 4th time, trying to find the part where it explains what he is supposed to do now. He is physiologically in his early 50s, though his chronological age is only 17. The accelerated aging that was once treated as merely unusual has become visibly catastrophic. His hair is grey, his knees ache when the weather shifts, and the Imperial medics, when he asked them about treatment, looked at him the way you might look at a machine that has finally worn out and simply told him there was nothing to be done. The discharge is formal, efficient, and utterly kind. Generous severance, a commendation for service, a recommendation for civilian work that no one in the Empire's economy has any actual use for a clone trooper to do. What Davis is beginning to understand, in a way that makes his stomach sick, is that no one is persecuting him. That would be easier somehow, to understand and to resist. Instead, he is simply becoming useless, and the machinery of the Empire is moving on without him, not out of cruelty, but out of straightforward bureaucratic necessity. On Centax II, where this whole dissolution began weeks after Order 66, Commander Cody stands in a supply depot and catalogues requests for transfer that have begun to arrive from across the Imperial military, each one asking for new stormtroopers, TK-designated recruits, fresh from the academies, men and women whose loyalty has been carefully instructed into them rather than grown in them like a cancer. Cody knows what this means, though he cannot quite force himself to think the words aloud. The Empire does not need him anymore. The Empire does not need any of them. And the careful, patient logic of that fact is beginning to spread through the clone ranks like something alive, a question passed quietly from bunk to bunk, from maintenance shift to maintenance shift. Why are we being moved? Why are we being replaced? Why does the Empire that created us, that called us the future of warfare, suddenly seem to have decided that we don't have a future at all? The question is dangerous because it requires no grand conspiracy, no dramatic persecution, nothing that can be easily pointed to and resisted. Only the recognition that you have been made for one purpose, and that purpose has ended, and no one is interested in what you might become next. In a quiet moment between duty cycles, a clone named Rex, one of the Bad Batch, genetically enhanced but still aging, still bearing the marks of the war they fought, speaks to a younger clone named Jensen and says something that Jensen will never quite forget. The programming wasn't the trap, I think. The trap was thinking we were ever supposed to live long enough to become anything but what we were made for. And Jensen, who is only 23 years old but looks 40, does not argue, because he has begun to suspect the same thing. By 16 BBY, The whispers have become a kind of dark current running through every Imperial garrison where clones still serve. A shared understanding that something has fundamentally changed, that they are no longer the architects of the Empire's future, but relics of a past that the Empire is working very carefully to put behind it. Some clones accept this with grim resignation, the same fatalism they learned to carry in the Clone Wars, when sacrificing for the cause seemed to mean something. Others begin to ask questions that the Empire has no interest in answering. Why was Commander Cody reassigned to interior security on Centax II, a posting so minor it barely qualifies as military service? Why were entire battalions suddenly transferred to remote stations? Why, when they ask the medical corps about the accelerated aging, do the doctors simply shrug and say there is no treatment? And perhaps most troubling, a question that no clone quite dares to voice aloud. Why does the Empire seem to be destroying the very evidence of how clones were created in the first place? Camino. Gone. The reports come quietly, almost casually. Orbital bombardment, the cloning facilities destroyed, the ocean world reduced to rubble, the Kaminoans scattered or disappeared. To someone who was not paying attention, it might seem like simple Imperial brutality, the kind of thing the Empire does to planets and peoples it no longer finds useful. But to a clone trooper, reading between the lines of carefully neutral Imperial communications, it begins to sound like something else. The erasure of witnesses, the destruction of records, the elimination of anyone who could explain where the clones came from, what they were made for, or why that purpose had now been discarded. It is in this period that surviving clones begin to divide silently into three categories. Those who remain in Imperial service, still hoping for purpose, still willing to obey the chain of command and believe that there is a plan they cannot yet see. Those who have begun to suspect the Empire's intentions and are searching quietly for a way to ask questions or escape. And those who have already made their choice and are beginning to move, slowly and carefully, toward whatever comes next. The brotherhood that held them together through 3 years of war, through the horrors of Order 66, through the first shock of the Empire's rise, is beginning to fracture. Not because of any external force, but because each clone is beginning to understand that they are alone in this now, that whatever happens to them, it will happen to each of them in isolation, separated by vast distances and the machinery of Imperial deployment. And there is something profoundly lonely in that realization, something that cuts deeper than fear or anger could ever reach. They were created to be together, to be brothers, to find meaning in the collective purpose of the army they served. And now, even that is being taken from them, not through violence but through simple, patient, bureaucratic erasure. The whispers in the ranks are not screams for rebellion or cries for justice. They are simply the sound of men beginning to understand that the galaxy has decided it no longer needs them and has begun the slow, careful work of forgetting they ever existed at all. Somewhere in the middle of the scatter, a clone named Divis walks off a transport on Ord Mantell and does not come back. He leaves his regulation pack on the dock, his Imperial discharge papers folded in the left breast pocket of a civilian shirt he bought in a market stall, and he simply walks inland toward the industrial districts where nobody asks questions and a man's past is nobody's business. There is no grand moment of decision, no philosophical reckoning with freedom, just the quiet understanding, after 3 years of watching his brothers disappear into the machinery of phased-out postings and decommissioning, that there is nothing left for him in the Empire's structure. The genetic clock ticking in his cells does not care about Imperial bureaucracy, and the Empire has made it clear that it will not pay for his aging, so he might as well age somewhere cheaper, somewhere the grey in his hair means nothing. Across the outer rim in these years, between 15 and 12 BBY, that walk happens again and again. A clone receives his discharge notice or his reassignment to a posting so remote it might as well be Excel, and he simply does not return from a supply run. Sometimes there is a forged death certificate on file somewhere. Sometimes there is just an absence that no one in the slowly shrinking stormtrooper bureaucracy bothers to investigate. I think about Cutter on Centax II, watching the last of his unit disappear into reassignments, making the calculation that staying will only prolong the waiting, that he is no longer a soldier because the Empire has determined he is no longer useful, and that the only choice left is the choice not to be where the Empire expects him to be. He takes a transport to the Outer Rim, the edge of everything, where the Empire's reach thins and records are less careful. He does not know what he will do there. He was engineered for war, trained for obedience, shaped in tanks and chambers and classroom scenarios, run by instructors who taught him how to follow orders and hold a blaster and die if necessary for his brothers. Nobody taught him how to live, because nobody expected him to have to. There are a handful of clones who had already learned that before the Empire rose. Cut Lorquain, who had deserted during the Clone Wars itself and settled on Salukami as a farmer, had a head start. A Twi'lek wife named Sue, children who knew him as something other than a soldier, land that needed hands and patience rather than tactical knowledge. When the Empire's machinery finally caught up with the idea of hunting down deserters, Cut was already years into the work of becoming someone else, teaching his hands to plant instead of kill, to build instead of destroy. But most of the clones scattering in this period had no such foundation. They had only the raw fact of being alive, of not having orders, of facing a biological clock that was running faster than it had any right to, with a body that looked like it was 50 years old, and a mind that had never been taught how to want anything but the next mission. The Empire, in its way, did them an accidental mercy. It did not hunt them systematically, because systematic hunting would require resources and attention, and the acknowledgement that clone troopers were worth the effort to pursue. Instead, the scattered clones simply fell off the Empire's roster, names deleted, records archived, the machinery of Imperial administration moving on to administrating fresh stormtroopers and new worlds and the expanding demands of the regime. A clone on Selos, and here I mean specifically Rex, though there would be others with him, understands that retirement cannot be a choice when no one has offered it, but it can be a fact when you simply stop answering your communicator and take a modified ATTE walker into the Badlands to hunt Juper, creatures that taste vaguely of home, even if nothing else in the galaxy does anymore. Wolf and Gregor join him because they too have realized that there is nowhere left to be a soldier, and if the Empire will not give them a purpose, they will manufacture one, tracking animals, fixing the walker, maintaining the small rituals of duty and brotherhood in miniature, away from anyone's eyes. This is not freedom, exactly. It is the absence of choice masquerading as choice, which is perhaps what freedom looks like to a clone. Across the scattered worlds, Mantel, Selos, Salukami, a dozen remote stations and mining colonies and agricultural outposts on the edge of the Outer Rim, clones are learning the same terrible lesson. That individuality, which they forged in the Brotherhood of War, cannot feed them or give them purpose. The names they had given themselves, Cutter, Devis, Rex, so many others whose personal armor markings had been painted over with Imperial white. Those names mean nothing in a civilian market. A man's skill with a blaster is liability in peaceful work. The tactical mind that was trained to calculate sight lines and ammunition and squad formations finds no use in stacking cargo or tending crops or maintaining the basic machinery of a life that does not require kill counts. And yet they do it, because the alternative is to stay where the Empire could find them, or to lie down and wait for the accelerated aging to finish the job. Some of the clones are hunted more actively than others, especially those of Clone Force 99, the Bad Batch, whose genetic anomalies made them resistant to their inhibitor chips, which made them dangerous in the Empire's eyes not because they had rebelled, but because they had proven to be unreliable, unpredictable. Hunter, Wrecker, Tech. The Empire's logic was as simple as ever. Anything that could not be controlled could not be trusted, so anything that could not be controlled should be eliminated. But for the majority of the scattered clones, the hunt is not active but passive. The Empire simply forgets them and they are left to figure out how to be people in a universe that never designed them to be people. There is a grief in this, a particular kind of loneliness that I find myself returning to, because these clones are learning something that their creators never intended them to learn. That you can be made for a purpose, and have that purpose taken away from you, and still be required to exist, still be trapped in a body that will age and fail and eventually die. They were manufactured soldiers, and the Empire manufactured something else to replace them. And now they are manufactured soldiers in a world that has no soldiers to be, stranded on backwater planets with only their brothers, those few they can find, and the slow, inescapable work of becoming something they were never taught how to be. One by one, or in small groups, the Legion scatters into the Outer Rim, the unexplored regions, the gaps in the Imperial map where a man might live quietly and grow old faster than anyone else in the galaxy, and nobody would need to know who he was, or what he had done, or that he had ever been a soldier at all. By the time the hunted phase began in earnest, around 12 years after the Empire's founding, the galaxy had largely forgotten that the clone army existed at all. The clones themselves had not forgotten, though some nights, lying alone in rented rooms on forgotten worlds, they seemed almost willing to let the memory go. But the Empire had not forgotten either, and in the Empire's remembering lay a different kind of threat than open war. The problem, as Imperial intelligence understood it, was not that there were too many clones left alive, but that the ones who remained knew too much. They carried in their heads the machinery of Order 66, the mechanics of how their own brains had been turned against them, knowledge that, if widely understood, might unravel the careful fiction the regime had constructed around the Jedi's destruction. They knew that Kaminoans had made them, which meant they knew clones could be made, which meant they understood that the Empire's monopoly on genetic soldiers was not inevitable, but engineered. And worse, some of them had proven capable of defying the command that had burned into their neural pathways before they were even born. That defiance, the bare fact that it was possible, could not be allowed to spread. So the Empire, having decided clones were obsolete as soldiers, now decided they were also dangerous as witnesses, and set about the quieter work of hunting them down. The hunters sent after the scattered clones were not stormtroopers or regular Imperial officers, though they received their orders through the same bureaucratic machinery. Instead, the Empire turned to a different kind of operative, bounty hunters, specialists, the sort of people who did not ask too many questions about why a target mattered, only how much they would be paid to bring the target in. Cad Bane was among the first deployed, the Duro's bounty hunter with the pale blue skin and the reputation that preceded him like a shadow, a man who had hunted for the Separatists during the Clone Wars and had no particular loyalty to anything except his own profit. There was a certain irony in that, though irony would have been lost on the Empire. It deployed against the clones the very mercenary networks that had once fought alongside them, in a way, on opposing sides. Fennec Shand was another, though her hunt was more specific and more personal, a brilliant tactician and assassin, hired ostensibly by someone anonymous, though the money came from Imperial accounts she knew better than to question. She was told to bring back a young clone, an unmodified genetic replica named Omega, and to bring her alive. The why of that did not matter to Fennec. The contract was lucrative enough to keep her moving through the Outer Rim, following patterns, checking cantinas and remote settlements, always drawing closer. For the clone defectors scattered across the galaxy, hiding on backwater farming worlds, working under false names on mining colonies, trying to disappear into the sprawl of dockyard crews and cargo runs. The arrival of bounty hunters was like the first chill that precedes a storm. They had not expected to be hunted, not really, not in any urgent sense. The Empire was content to let them fade away, to leave them undisturbed as long as they remained quiet and did not attempt to organize or speak too openly about what they had been. But bounty hunters changed the mathematics of survival. Bounty hunters meant someone had assigned a price to your head, which meant you were no longer simply forgotten. You were actively sought, and every conversation in every cantina might be the one that gave you away. The Bad Batch, fragmented though they were by this time, understood the danger more acutely than most. Hunter, Wrecker, Tech, Crosshair, and Echo had never fully integrated into the Imperial stormtrooper structure. Their genetic mutations gave them advantages and liabilities in equal measure, and their history of non-compliance made them unreliable to the regime. By 12 years after Order 66, they had been operating in the Outer Rim for years, taking mercenary contracts, staying mobile, keeping to the fringes of a galaxy they had once fought to protect. The hunt for Omega, the young unmodified clone who carried genetic secrets the Empire was desperate to study, brought the Inquisitorius and bounty hunters together in ways that forced the Bad Batch into the open. There was an Imperial clone assassin who called himself CX-2, a soldier engineered specifically for the role of Hunter. His loyalty burned into his genetics in ways the defectors had begun to escape. The Inquisitors themselves, though primarily tasked with hunting the scattered Jedi survivors, occasionally turned their attention to clone genetics when Imperial intelligence deemed it necessary. The Inquisitorius was led by a pawn called the Grand Inquisitor, a former Jedi Temple Guard who had survived Order 66 and bent his Force sensitivity to the service of the Empire, and beneath him moved a hierarchy of lesser Inquisitors. The Second Sister, the Ninth Sister, the Fifth Brother, all of them trained to hunt and kill, all of them with access to the resources the Empire could bring to bear on a persistent problem. For clones like Cutter, hiding in the outskirts of a port city on a rim world whose name he tried not to remember too clearly, the awareness that bounty hunters were moving through the galaxy created a different kind of weight. It meant staying more careful, changing his face among the drifters and the forgotten, never allowing the same contact twice, never staying in one place long enough to develop the kind of connection that might lead someone to his door. It meant understanding that the only way to survive was to continue the process he had begun years before. The slow disappearance of the person the Empire had made him into, until nothing remained but a ghost moving through civilian corridors where clones were not supposed to exist. The strange mercy in it was that the bounty hunters, by and large, had no specific interest in finding every defector. They had assignments, targets, clones who carried genetic material the Empire wanted or knowledge that proved too dangerous. The vast majority of the scattered clones were left alone, not because they were safe, but because the Empire had simply decided they were not worth the cost of catching. It was another form of the same abandonment that had characterized the entire process. The Empire would kill the ones it decided mattered, let the rest slowly fade away under the weight of accelerated aging and the knowledge that no one would remember them when they were gone. There was something unbearably sad in that arithmetic, and in the spaces of silence that followed each defector's quiet disappearance from the worlds they tried to build lives on. The hunting phase was not a war. It was the long, quiet aftermath of one, the mechanism by which the Empire ensured that the witnesses to its crimes would not live to speak them aloud. And in cantinas across the Outer Rim, in the sparse quarters of remote outposts, clone troopers, whose names had once meant something in the army they belonged to, sat quietly and listened for footsteps, understanding at last that their brothers had been right to disappear, and that the only way forward was to disappear themselves into the accumulated silence of a galaxy that had decided to forget them entirely. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, on a star destroyer called the Resolute, there existed a battalion of clone troopers who did not yet know that they were the last of their kind. They had been assigned to this post 8 years ago, when the Empire was still young, and the transition from clone to stormtrooper was presented as simple bureaucratic reorganization. They called themselves the 407th Legion, and they knew each other the way that only brothers forged in 3 years of galactic war could know one another. By 11 BBY, most of them were physiologically in their 50s or 60s. their accelerated aging advancing relentlessly, but they carried themselves with the discipline of the soldiers they had always been. What they did not know was that across the galaxy, their brothers had been scattered into deserts and deep colonies, had deserted into silence, had aged alone in discharge centers, or had simply vanished into the machinery of imperial replacement. They had no way of knowing, because the Empire had ensured there was no way to know. The isolation was not dramatic, it was architectural. Commander Kep, a weathered clone with grey creeping through his hair, walked the corridors of the Resolute the way he had walked every corridor for 8 years, with the assumption that somewhere his brothers were doing the same. His armor bore the faint traces of old markings, blue and grey, painted when the Republic still stood. But those had been painted over in Imperial white years ago, leaving only the shadow of what had once been there. There's something I want you to understand about this moment in the story. These clones were not neglected because they were hated. They were forgotten because they had become inconvenient in a way that hatred requires effort to maintain. The Empire did not despise the clone army. It had simply decided, with the cold mathematics of Vice Admiral Rampart's bureaucratic machine, that conscripted stormtroopers were more cost-effective. Cheaper to recruit, faster to train in ideology, easier to replace, and crucially, carrying no memories of the Republic or the Jedi. The 407th did not know any of this. They performed their duties, maintenance of the Resolute's weapon systems, patrol of the lower decks, coordination of supply chains, with the competence that was bred into them before they ever drew their first breath in Kamino's cloning chambers. But a slow, quiet erosion had begun in the years since the transition started. Fewer new assignments came down from Imperial Command. The postings they received were increasingly routine. Promotions stopped happening sometime around 17 BBY and never resumed. Younger officers, true Imperial Naval Academy graduates, not clone-born soldiers, began to look at them with a particular kind of pity, the pity reserved for things that are technically still functioning but obviously dying. Commander Kep had begun to count his brother's absences. In 18 BBY, there had been 412 clones assigned to the 407th Legion, which explained nothing about the number, but pleased them with its coincidence. By 19 BBY, as the phasing out accelerated, that number had dropped to 387. By 21 BBY, to 356. By the present day, 11 BBY, they numbered 289. When Kep asked about transfers or retirements, he received official silence in response, the kind of silence that fills the space where refusal is so absolute it need not even be spoken aloud. The Resolute was a newer star destroyer, part of the Empire's vast naval expansion, and as such it carried the assumption that it would be crewed by the Empire's future. Stormtroopers, Imperial Navy officers, the ideologically pure and enthusiastically compliant. The presence of the 407th was a legacy situation, a remnant not quite removed, a problem the administrative machinery had not yet gotten around to solving. And so they waited in the corridors of their aging post, performing their duties with the same precision they had learned during the Clone Wars, unaware that their precision had become irrelevant. On the lower observation deck, Private Sarlis, a clone who had once painted his helmet in the colors of the 501st Legion, who had served under Anakin Skywalker, who had bled on worlds he could no longer quite remember, stood looking out at the starfield. He was thinking, though he did not quite have the language for what he was thinking. Something was ending. He could feel it in the way the younger officers looked through them, in the way new orders came down with less frequency, in the strange, hollow knowledge that none of them were being replaced by younger clones, that the 407th was simply aging into obsolescence on a ship designed for the Empire's future. He had not yet realized that there would be no more young clones, that Kamino was silent, that the vast chambers of Topoka City, where he had grown, lay at the bottom of an ocean, sunk beneath Imperial bombardment. He only knew that something was ending, and that no one had bothered to tell them why. Commander Kep maintained the fiction of purpose, as he had been designed to do, but the fiction was becoming harder to sustain. In quiet moments, he found himself thinking about Rex, Captain Rex, the ARC trooper who had served with him in the Grand Army, who had disappeared sometime in the chaos of the early Imperial period and had never been officially accounted for. In the silence of the Resolute, Kep wondered if Rex had run, or if something else had happened, or if he was simply aboard some other Star Destroyer on some other edge of the Empire, performing the same slow erosion toward irrelevance. He would never know. The 407th had no communication with other clone units. The isolation was complete and by design, though they did not know it. What strikes me most about this period, looking back at it, is the terrible efficiency of the Empire's method. It did not drag them to execution chambers or hunt them across the galaxy like it hunted bounty hunters and Jedi. It simply allowed them to become obsolete, to age in place, to fade while being technically still alive and still in service, their brothers vanishing so gradually and so completely that even those closest to them could not be certain whether they had been transferred or retired or something darker. And all the while, the 407th performed their duties on a Star Destroyer that did not want them, in an Empire that had already replaced them, waiting for orders that would never come, their brotherhood intact but increasingly invisible, their sacrifice already forgotten by the very regime they had helped to create. By the end of this year, the 407th would still exist, still be performing their functions, still be precisely as isolated and unaware as they were now. But they were living at the end of an era, though no one had thought to tell them. And in the darkness between stars, that knowledge was the only thing that waited for them. It is strange to think that some of them found their way back to war, not out of loyalty, but out of something that looked, from a distance, almost like redemption. They did not choose the rebellion the way a soldier chooses a side. They stumbled into it, worn and aged, carrying nothing but the muscle memory of 3 years fighting a war they no longer understood. By the time the rebellion began to take real shape in the earlier years, around 10 BBY, when the Empire was still consolidating its grip, there were perhaps hundreds of clone troopers scattered across the galaxy, most of them trying not to be seen. But some of them, a smaller number still, began to recognize something in the rebellion's struggle that felt familiar. A fight against what the Empire had become, which meant a fight against what they themselves had been made to serve. I find myself thinking about Captain Rex often when I consider this period, because his story contains the whole of it. The shame, the survival, the strange possibility of meaning found in resistance. Rex had been the first, perhaps, to truly understand what he carried inside his own head. That inhibitor chip, removed in the dark by Ahsoka Tano's hands before Order 66 could complete itself, before his hands could kill the Jedi general he loved. He had seen his brothers execute Protocol 66, had seen Cody stand beside General Kenobi and pull the trigger, and he had lived with that knowledge in a way that few clones could survive. When Rex finally found his way to Selos, a remote planet in the Outer Rim where time seemed to have stopped entirely, he was no longer the soldier the Republic had made him. He was something the Empire had never accounted for, a clone who had chosen his own path. There, in a modified ATTE Walker that he and 2 other survivors, Commander Wolf and Captain Gregor, had salvaged and rebuilt into a kind of home, Rex lived a life of studied solitude, hunting Jupiter across the salt plains, waiting for the galaxy to forget he had ever existed. Wolf, who had led the Wolf Pack through the darkest campaigns, had retired to that same Walker carrying a different burden. The paranoia of a soldier who expected the Empire to come for him to settle accounts for his survival and his defection. Gregor, the ARC trooper commando who had fought in conflicts across the galaxy, had found in Selos something closer to peace, though it was the peace of a man who knew he was marked as surplus and was content to spend his final years out of reach. For a time, the 3 of them existed in a kind of stasis. neither fighting nor fully living, occupying a space where the Empire's machinery could not quite reach them. But the rebellion, when it came to them, did not arrive as ideology or propaganda. It arrived as a choice, and perhaps that is what made it possible. It came first through Captain Hera Syndulla and a small crew aboard a vessel called the Ghost, searching for rebel cells, searching for allies, searching for any scrap of military expertise that might matter against the Imperial machine. When Hera found Rex on that remote world, she found a man who had already made his peace with being useless, and she offered him something he had not expected to want: relevance again, but on terms he could choose. There is something quieter about serving a cause you have chosen than serving an order you were programmed to obey, even if the service looks identical from the outside. Rex accepted, and in accepting, he became something the Empire had designed him to be incapable of becoming: a free soldier, fighting not because he was made for war, but because he had decided that this war mattered. He and Wolf and Gregor joined the Phoenix Cell, the network of rebel resistance that was beginning to knit itself together across the Outer Rim, and they brought with them something invaluable: the lived experience of 3 years fighting the Separatists, the muscle memory of large-scale campaigns, the understanding of tactics and strategy that came not from training, but from survival. The intelligence Rex provided, the locations of Imperial fuel depots, the movements of supply convoys, the vulnerabilities in protocol and procedure, came from a man who had once served the Imperial system and understood its logic intimately. But perhaps more important than what they knew was what they represented: proof that a clone trooper could think for himself, could resist the Empire that had made him, could fight against the very regime he had once served. When Agent Callus of the Empire's Intelligence Bureau came to silos looking for rebels, he found 3 aging clones in a walker, and Wolf, remembering his terror at being replaced, remembered his own desire to be accepted back into the Imperial fold, and he made a choice that nearly destroyed everything. He activated an Imperial beacon, believing that cooperation might offer him and his brothers a way home, a way to be useful again, a way to not be abandoned. But when the Imperial forces arrived, something shifted in Wolf. Perhaps it was seeing that the rebellion would fight for those 3 old men despite what they were, despite what they had been. Perhaps it was understanding finally that there was no home to return to, that the Empire had never wanted them back. Whatever it was, Wolf destroyed the beacon himself, choosing rebellion over the ghost of Imperial acceptance, choosing his brothers over the machinery that had made him. The 3 of them fought, old men with accelerated aging creasing their faces, their bodies betraying them with every movement, but their training and their choices holding them upright. And they survived, and they became fully, irrevocably rebels. Across the galaxy, in smaller numbers, other clones were making similar choices. Clone Force 99, the defective soldiers whose genetic aberrations had made them resistant to Order 66, had already begun their own resistance to the Empire. Echo, the ARC trooper who had been captured and tortured and rebuilt into an Imperial assassin droid, had escaped and was slowly working to undo what had been done to him. These were not the kind of recruitment stories the rebellion's propagandists wanted to tell. There was no purity in them, no clear moral arc, but they were real and they mattered. A clone trooper joining the rebellion was not redemption in the way a historian might write it. It was something smaller and more personal. A soldier recognizing that the regime he had fought for was not the republic he had served, understanding that his choice to resist it might be the only real choice he had ever made. By the time of the Galactic Civil War's most active years, the era we will come to in later chapters, there were perhaps 24 clone troopers fighting in rebel cells scattered across the Outer Rim and beyond, and each one carried with them the same strange duality. They were the weapons the Empire had created, now turned against it, and in turning against it, they were perhaps the first true proof that the clones themselves had never been entirely what they were made to be. The rebellion did not offer them forgiveness. They did not ask for it, perhaps because they knew that forgiveness was not the point. But it offered them this, a war that they could choose, brothers who would choose them in return, and the possibility, however fragile, that their lives might mean something other than efficient obsolescence. There is a quiet dignity in that choice, and I find myself returning to it often, not because it fixed what had been broken, but because some of them, at least, refused to remain broken in the way they were designed to be. By 5 BBY, a clone trooper walking through a crowded spaceport on Mos Eisley would look like a man in his 50s or 60s, weathered by accelerated time, though he might still remember being young barely more than a decade ago. The mathematics of it never became easier to live with. They were grown in tanks to mature in half the normal time, and in an ordinary life of perhaps 60 standard years, they would have aged through their whole existence in 30. But their lives were not ordinary, and the galaxy rarely grants its soldiers the mercy of an ordinary length. Most clones were already gone by this point. The galaxy had either forgotten them or never truly known they existed at all. The ones who remained were scattered so thoroughly across remote worlds and forgotten stations that finding another clone felt like finding a ghost of yourself. There was Rex on Silos, a former captain who had somehow managed to escape the worst of it, hunting creatures called Juper in the rust-colored wastes with 2 other survivors, Wolf and Gregor, living out their remaining years in a modified walker they had repurposed as shelter, more like a tomb than a home. That image has stayed with me. These men who commanded millions, who executed perfect military operations on worlds whose names are no longer recorded, spending their final decades digging for burrowing creatures in desert that ask nothing of them except that they die there quietly. There's a strange mercy in that, I think, and a tremendous sadness. For the others, the roads diverged in ways large and small, but nearly all of them led away from the light. Cutter, the clone we followed at the beginning of all this, had simply vanished into the outer rim after his discharge papers were signed by a bored Imperial administrator who did not look at him as he processed them. There was no ceremony, no recognition of his service, no pension that any institution intended to honor. The Empire had calculated the cost of supporting aging clones, medical care for accelerated degenerative aging, housing, disability assistance, and determined it was cheaper to simply let them go and pretend they had never existed. The bureaucratic mathematics of it was almost elegant in its cruelty. Do not persecute, do not imprison, simply do not provide. Let biology do what ideology could not. The inhibitor chip that had controlled so many of them no longer mattered once they were discharged. It was their own bodies that had become their jailer. Across the galaxy, clones who had somehow survived the chaos of Order 66 and the years of quiet obsolescence found themselves facing a problem their creators had never anticipated. What does a genetically engineered soldier do when the war ends, when the Empire does not want him, when his own cells are betraying him from the inside? Some clones, like Devis, had simply walked away, abandoned his discharge papers on Ord Mantell, tried to become someone new, and discovered that a person born in a laboratory, trained for nothing but combat, and given 30 years of effective lifespan for purposes of imperial efficiency, does not slip easily into civilian life. The galaxy was full of displaced beings, refugees, survivors of wars and purges, but none of them quite matched the particular alienation of a clone trooper. They had brothers they could no longer find. They had names they had chosen, but no story to go with them. They had an entire culture built on loyalty and sacrifice that had been erased by the very regime that had inherited it. You could not explain yourself to a stranger on a spaceport for very long without revealing what you were, and what you were made it difficult to move through the galaxy without drawing attention you did not want. The shared face was both a kind of invisibility. The Empire had trained millions of stormtroopers, and who counted the numbered ones beneath the helmets, and a profound visibility that made you a curiosity, a remnant, a thing that belonged to a war that was officially over but still hung in the air like smoke. Some clones tried to hide in plain sight, purchasing false documentation, dyeing their hair, seeking posts in civilian jobs that would not require extensive background verification. Others retreated entirely into the furthest reaches of the galaxy, where the Empire's reach was thin and the past asked fewer questions. The worst fate, in a way, was the kind that befell the 407th Legion aboard the Star Destroyer Resolute in 11 BBY, a unit of clone soldiers who served the Empire faithfully, unaware that they were the last of their kind, watching their numbers dwindle month by month as no replacements ever arrived. No new assignments ever came. No future was ever offered. They had not been discharged. They had been left to age in place, a slow fade to irrelevance, knowing something was ending, but lacking the context to understand quite what. By the time the rebellion came looking for them, the ones who had removed their inhibitor chips or who had somehow escaped the worst of the Empire's machinery, these men were physiologically ancient. Rex had managed it, had found other clones, and built something like a life on silos. And when the rebellion came with the offer of one more war, one final purpose, there was something almost like peace in accepting it. It was not redemption, because they had done nothing that required redeeming, but it was meaning of a kind the Empire would never offer. For the others, the meaning never came. They aged in quarters that wanted them gone, in barracks that no longer had space for them, in a military that had decided they were the past, and moved on to the future of stormtroopers and ideology. There's something I keep thinking about, and I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. These men were made to be tools, to be used up and discarded, and the extraordinary thing is that despite that, or maybe because of it, they became people with real names and real bonds and real sacrifices. They became brothers in the most literal sense, forged not by blood, but by choice made in the face of engineered obedience. And then the galaxy they had bled for ceased to need them, and they were cast out into a universe that did not know what to do with them and did not particularly care to figure it out. The aging that happened was not some tragic misfortune. It was part of the design, the only design they had ever been given. But the abandonment, that was something else. That was a choice made by very human people, with very human cruelty, disguised as efficiency. The last clone troopers of the late Imperial era were men in their 50s and 60s, physiologically, living out the remainder of their unplanned lives in the margins of a galaxy that had used them and forgotten them almost in the same breath. They moved through the darkness quietly, these ghosts of the clone wars, neither fully dead nor truly alive, carrying in their bodies the accelerated weight of a lifetime of service for a cause that had already moved on. And sometimes, in distant cantinas and remote settlements, they would find each other, just long enough to remember that they had not been alone, that once they had been brothers, that once, for a brief moment in the history of a vast galaxy, they had mattered. Then they would drift apart again into the infinite dark, aging quietly, fading, the last witnesses to a story no one wanted told. In the years between 16 and 0 BBY, as the Empire's grip tightened across the outer rim and the core worlds alike, a quieter kind of disappearing took place, not dramatic flight, but something almost invisible. Clones going to ground in the very places the Empire considered beneath notice. In the sprawling industrial cities of the galactic core, in the maintenance levels beneath great starports, and in the worker colonies of the outer rim, clone troopers did something they had never been engineered to do. They learned to be nobody. Some of them simply never left their postings when discharge papers arrived. They stayed in the dormitories and barracks, let themselves be absorbed into the endless rotation of Imperial service, their faces indistinguishable beneath white stormtrooper helmets from every other trooper in the line. There is something worth sitting with in that choice, the deliberate erasure of the very identity they had fought so hard to claim during the Clone Wars, when each brother had painted his armor with personal colors and chosen a name to call himself. But a painted helmet was a target, was a distinction, was a vulnerability in an empire that demanded uniformity and obedience. So they unpainted themselves and disappeared into the ranks, becoming the very machines they had always resisted being. On the world of Coruscant itself, the capital, clones who had once served as senatorial guards or temple security simply remained in their quarters when their units were deactivated, learning to forge duty rosters and supply requisitions, embedding themselves so thoroughly into the bureaucratic machinery that no one ever quite noticed they had been scheduled for discharge. It was not safe, exactly. Nothing about being a clone hiding in plain sight among the Empire's own forces could ever be called safe. But it was, in its way, available. They had food, quarters, purpose measured in shifts and drills, the familiar rhythm of military life. And perhaps that was all some of them could manage after everything else had been stripped away. Others took a different path. They left the military entirely, but they did not flee to the Outer Rim or the hidden settlements where other clones had gathered. Instead, they moved into the dense urban centers, into the machine cities and manufacturing worlds where an extra labourer was unremarkable. On worlds like Narkina 5, where prison factories turned out starship components and weapons for the Imperial war machine, aging clones mixed with conscripted workers and petty criminals, their genetic identity buried beneath years of dust and exhaustion, and the simple, crushing weight of being treated as indistinguishable from any other expendable worker. I find myself thinking often about the particular cruelty of that choice, that to survive, they had to become exactly what they had spent 3 years of war becoming something more than: interchangeable, forgettable, useful only for their labor, their individuality not forbidden but rendered entirely irrelevant. In the cargo hauling stations and dockside settlements of the Outer Rim, clones who had chosen to leave the Empire behind sometimes took work under assumed names, their identical faces hidden beneath maintenance crew hoods or the worn caps of freighter handlers, moving through the margins of the galaxy where the Empire's eye was less sharp. There is a particular exhaustion in that kind of hiding that goes deeper than simple fear. It is the exhaustion of being known, from the inside, to be both too valuable and completely disposable, of carrying genetic secrets in your own cells that people would hunt you for if they knew, while also being utterly ordinary in every way that mattered to civilian eyes. The clones who survived in the cities, hidden in plain sight, developed small rituals of recognition that no one else would ever understand. The way a clone trooper might nod slightly when passing another clone in stormtrooper whites, a gesture so small that an observer would dismiss it as coincidence or fatigue. They would sometimes gather in the lower levels of spaceports or in the worker cantinas of industrial worlds, sitting quietly in corners, nursing drinks that tasted like nothing, and simply being in the presence of other beings who carried the same genetic template, the same accelerated aging consuming their bodies from within, the same fracture between what they had been made to be and what they had become. Some of them, particularly those who had served in positions close to the Jedi before Order 66, carried memories so terrible and so isolating that they could not afford to speak of them to anyone, not to other clones, not to anyone. So they existed in a kind of profound solitude even when they were not alone. I think of Commander Cody, who served the Empire in roles of authority and supervision, watching younger clones and conscripts move through their training, knowing exactly what machinery had been built into all of them, unable to speak of it, unable to act on it, aging incrementally with no medical support and no way to explain the deterioration to the non-clone doctors who treated him as a standard Imperial officer. Or the clones who found their way into the ranks of TK stormtroopers, conscripts and birth-born recruits brought in wholesale to replace the aging clone legions, and had to train them, had to watch them move through formations that the clones themselves had perfected over years of actual warfare, had to acknowledge day after day that these inexperienced conscripts represented the future, while they themselves had become a past that the Empire intended to erase. By 3 BBY, clone troopers scattered across Imperial worlds were biologically showing the signs of accelerated aging that could no longer be hidden. Grey in their hair that shouldn't have been there yet, the particular stiffness in the joints that came from aging too fast, the way younger Imperial officers sometimes looked at them with a mixture of confusion and distaste, trying to understand why this particular soldier seemed to have lived twice as long as his chronological service record suggested. The Empire had no medical solution for them anymore. Camino was gone, its cloning chambers destroyed, its scientists either working in Imperial black sites or dead, and the bureaucratic machinery of Imperial service simply did not provide for the peculiar needs of rapidly aging soldiers. So they endured, bearing witness to their own deterioration, moving through their days with the particular kind of patience that comes from having survived the unsurvivable more than once, carrying memories of 3 years of brotherhood across the Clone Wars, of Order 66, of being unmade and remade into something they did not choose, and now of being unmade again, slowly, in a way they had seen coming but could not prevent. The clones who were hidden in plain sight were not heroes. There is no heroism in simply surviving, in finding ways to continue existing in a galaxy that had decided to be finished with you. But there is something in their quiet persistence, in the way they remain themselves despite every pressure to become machinery or nothing, or to vanish entirely. Something worth remembering, even if, by 3 BBY, the galaxy itself was doing everything it could to forget. They were still out there, in the uniform of the Empire that had replaced them, in the worker clothes of industrial worlds, in the margins of cantinas in the Outer Rim, aging into lives they had never been built for, waiting for a future that they would have to make up for themselves, because no one else had ever bothered to imagine one for them. And though they did not know it yet, in a few years, some of them would be given the choice to fight again, not as the perfect soldiers the Empire had engineered, but as free men choosing their own war, and perhaps in that choice, they would find something closer to the purpose they had glimpsed so briefly once during the Clone Wars, when brotherhood still felt like it might mean something forever. Tonight I want to tell you about the clone veterans who drifted into the cantinas and spaceports of the Outer Rim in those final years before the rebellion struck, carrying with them the weight of wars no one asked them to fight and memories no one wished to hear. By 0 BBY, the year the rebellion would strike at the Death Star, though the cantina crowds did not yet know it, the clone troopers were old men in the bodies of what should have been young soldiers, aging at twice the speed of any natural being, scattered across a galaxy that had made itself very efficient at forgetting them. Mos Eisley on Tatooine became one of those places where they gathered, not by design but by gravity. The spaceport was old, the laws were thin, the huts controlled the territory rather than the Empire, and there was a cantina, Chalmun's place, everyone called it, where the barkeep didn't ask too many questions about who came through the door. I find myself thinking about what it must have meant to sit in that cantina, at the edge of a table in the corner, nursing a drink that cost more than a day's wages on the outer settlements, and feel the weight of your own body aging faster than time itself could justify. These were men who had been built for one purpose: to serve the Jedi, to fight the separatist wars, to be brothers in arms across 3 years of bloodshed and sacrifice on worlds whose names they had once known by heart. The accelerated aging was not a cruel surprise by the time of the rebellion's rise. It was simply the condition of remaining alive, the price written into their very genetics from the moment they were grown in the tanks of Topoka City, back when the Kaminoans were still alive to apologize for nothing. Some of them were physiologically 60 years old, their hair gray or gone, their hands marked with scars from campaigns most of the galaxy had forgotten had ever happened, their bodies moving with the careful weight of men whose muscles had betrayed them years ahead of schedule. And yet there they were, in the cantinas of Mos Eisley and Mos Cavendish, in the dockside settlements of Ord Mantell, in the worker colonies of the Outer Rim. Men who still moved like soldiers, even when their bodies could barely support the weight of that training. There's something I want you to understand about how a clone trooper ends up alone in a spaceport cantina at 30 chronological years old, looking in the mirror at the face of a 70-year-old man. It's not one dramatic moment of persecution that does it, but 1,000 small abandonments, each of them logical, each of them explained away, each of them chosen by someone in the Empire's vast machinery because it made sense on a spreadsheet. Cutter, the trooper we followed in the earliest hours after Order 66, when he woke in an empty barracks, not knowing what had happened to his brothers. By this time, he was one of those voices in the shadows of a cantina, aging in real time, watching younger recruits who had never known the Clone Wars filter through Tatooine's spaceports, and saying nothing. The inhibitor chip that had compelled him to betray the Jedi was still in his skull, a scar in his neural pathways that no Imperial doctor had ever offered to remove, a secret he carried with him like a wound that would not close. There were others in those cantinas too, the kind of men you would not notice unless you were looking for them, and most of the galaxy had stopped looking a long time ago. Some of them had deserted in the early years after the face-out, when it became clear that the Empire had simply decided to replace them and was going to be patient about it. Devis, who had left his discharge papers behind on Ord Mantell like a man, dropping the last weight holding him underwater. Faceless soldiers who had simply not reported to their next reassignment and had instead boarded transports bound for the Outer Rim, where the Imperial presence was thin and memory was even thinner. Some of them were still serving in the Imperial military, some lost in the vast machine of stormtrooper legions, their clone faces hidden beneath white helmets that were never meant for them, anonymous in a way their colored armor had never allowed them to be, and drifting into port towns on shore leave, looking for other voices that remembered things, looking for brothers they would never find again. Others had made different choices. Captain Rex had left the Empire entirely, had found his way to the rebellion and to a kind of freedom that his engineering had never anticipated. But Rex was rare. A man with his inhibitor chip removed before Order 66 ever triggered. A man with a choice that most of his brothers had never possessed. The clones in Mos Eisley's cantinas carried different stories, all of them circling around a single fact that none of them could quite speak aloud. They had been made for war, given brothers an identity in the forge of 3 years of bloodshed, and then simply discarded when the war was over and the Empire decided that ideology was cheaper than biology. What strikes me, thinking about this now, is the quietness of it all, the complete absence of drama in their abandonment. No one came to hunt most of them. No one came to execute them. The Empire simply let them go and let their own bodies finish the work that bureaucracy had begun. They aged, and the galaxy moved on, and the rebellion gathered strength in the stars, and clone veterans in the spaceport cantinas of the Outer Rim carried with them the truth about Order 66, about what the inhibitor chips had done, about the Jedi they had been engineered to betray, about the moment the war had turned, and they had understood that they were not soldiers of the Republic anymore, but machines of the Empire. They did not speak of it, mostly, not in ways that could be heard. The few who tried to tell their stories found that no one believed them, or no one wanted to listen, or both. The cantinas were places where droids were forbidden by house rule, and the humans who came through the doors had learned, through survival, to say nothing that would draw the attention of Imperial security forces. But there was a kind of communication that happened anyway between the aging clones who found each other in those marginal spaces. A recognition in a glance, a specific way of sitting at a table that spoke to military discipline, a scar that matched another man's scar from a battle fought on a world whose name only they remembered. I think about what it must have meant to be one of those men, to have been born in a laboratory, to have been engineered for a single purpose, to have lived through the most significant military conflict the galaxy had seen in centuries, and then to spend the remaining years of your accelerated life aging quietly in the margins, watching the rebellion rise in whispered news that filtered in through the spaceports, sensing that the empire you had once served was beginning to fracture, and knowing that it did not matter much whether it won or fell. The purpose had already drained away, the brotherhood had already been scattered, the future no longer held them, whatever the outcome. What remained was the weight of memory, the ache of bodies that were destroying themselves from the inside out, and the profound isolation of being alive in a galaxy that had successfully forgotten you were ever there. And yet they persisted, these men in the cantinas and spaceports, carrying their stories like ghosts, waiting for the end with a kind of quiet dignity that their engineering had never been designed to teach them, but which they had somehow forged anyway, through 3 years of war, through the terrible morning of Order 66, through years of abandonment and aging and forgetting. They were still there when the rebellion struck, still aging, still waiting, the last witnesses to a war that the galaxy was already learning not to remember. The Emperor was dead, and somehow that changed almost nothing for the men who had built the empire that killed him. It happened at Endor, in orbit above a forest moon, when Vader threw Palpatine down a reactor shaft, and the second Death Star broke apart like a child's toy falling into fire. The news reached the scattered clones slowly. Through Imperial broadcasts they no longer trusted, through whispers in spaceport cantinas, through the simple fact that the Star Destroyers stopped issuing orders quite so sharply. But by 4 ABY, when the Emperor fell, there were almost no clones left to hear it. The Grand Army of the Republic had been gone for 15 years, replaced so completely and so methodically that the younger stormtroopers in Imperial white, human recruits who had never known the old war, did not even know they were serving beside the ghosts of something older. I find myself thinking about the men who did survive to see that moment, because they had to contend with something the dead never had to face. Hope followed almost immediately by the realization that hope had never been meant for them. On Selos, in the Outer Rim, Captain Rex sat with Wolf and Gregor aboard an old ATTE Walker, the three of them aged beyond their years, their accelerated biology catching up with them at last, when the message came that the rebellion had won. Rex had spent years waiting for some kind of reckoning, some moment when the Jedi's ghosts would be avenged, and the order that had destroyed him and his brothers might finally make sense in reverse. Endor gave him that, or seemed to. But what Endor did not give him was an explanation for the 15 years of abandonment that came before it, or any guarantee that the New Republic would understand what his existence had cost or meant. Across the galaxy, in military prisons and administrative posts, and on forgotten worlds, other clones heard the news in much the same way, with the exhausted realization that something had ended and that their own endings had perhaps come some time ago. Cutter, drifting through the spaceports of the Outer Rim, aging visibly now, his hair grey though he was still biologically young, heard it in a cantina on a nameless world and felt nothing, or rather, felt the complicated absence of something he had been trained not to feel. The rebellion's victory was not his victory because he had never been asked to choose it. It was simply the conclusion of a war he had watched from the margins, invisible and unnecessary. The New Republic, when it began to take shape in the months after Endor, faced a peculiar problem that no one quite knew how to solve: what to do with the clone troopers who had survived. Mon Mothma, the new Chancellor, inherited a galaxy full of ghosts. Men who had been engineered before the Republic ever existed, who had served it faithfully for 3 years in a war that was not their choosing, and who had then been systematically abandoned by the regime that replaced it. The official documents, the ones that survived the Empire's fall, told the story clearly enough. Clones had been phased out beginning in 19 BBY, replaced by natural-born recruits, their accelerated aging making them unsuitable for long service, their cost-benefit ratio rendering them obsolete. That was the administrative language, and it was technically true. It was also a story that required the Republic to somehow make amends for an abandonment it had not directly orchestrated, but which it had inherited nonetheless. The thing no one had prepared the new government for was the question of what recognition was owed to soldiers who had been engineered without choice, bound by loyalty codes written into their very biology, and then cast aside when they were no longer useful. Officially, the New Republic issued statements acknowledging the clone service in the Clone Wars. Medals were struck, citations written, honors recorded. But Rex, when he finally made his way back to Coruscant after Endor, found something more complicated: gratitude that did not quite know how to express itself, and sympathy that carried an edge of discomfort. the suspicion that the clones had always been somewhat other, somewhat not quite citizens, and that their struggle belonged to an era people wanted very much to move past. The worst part, I think, was that Rex understood this perfectly. He had been made to understand it. For 15 years, he had been invisible, and invisibility is something you learn so thoroughly that even recognition, when it finally comes, does not quite reach you. The survivors scattered. Some, like Rex, accepted the rebellion's invitation to fight against the Imperial remnant forces that still fought on for a year after Endor, holding the line until the final peace at Jakku in 5 ABY. Others, like the veterans hiding in stormtrooper armor or in the industrial cities where they had learned to disappear, simply continued on as they had been, old men still in white helmets, still taking orders, still waiting for something that might never come. A few attempted civilian life. Wolf and Gregor had already spent years doing so on silos, and they continued there, aging quietly, their bond with Rex remaining the single most real thing any of them possessed. The thing that haunted the survivors, I believe, was not bitterness, though there was certainly that, but rather a profound confusion about what they were supposed to become. They had been born to be soldiers. They had been made into individuals through war. And then they had been unmade by history, told that the war was over, and given no instruction manual for personhood. The New Republic offered them pensions, eventually, and recognition, and memorials, all the things a government offers when it has failed to do right by someone and wishes to perform the gesture of having done so. But these were things meant for soldiers who had a before and an after, people who could choose to retire and become something else. The clones had no before. Their entire existence before the Clone Wars was a tank of nutrient solution and an accelerated childhood they barely remembered. After the Clone Wars, there was only deterioration and abandonment. After the Empire fell, there was gratitude and visibility, and still no earthly idea of what came next. By the time of the New Republic's consolidation, the surviving clones were aging at an impossible rate, their accelerated biology leaving them visibly elderly while still decades away from a natural lifespan that had never been natural to begin with. In that gap, between what they had been made to be and what the galaxy would now allow them to become, they lived out the remainder of their engineered lives with a quietness that broke my heart when I first learned it. They did not rage. They did not demand. They simply continued as they had always been trained to, accepting the small mercies the New Republic offered, while understanding perfectly that mercy was not owed and would never fully erase what had been done to them. The Emperor was dead, and the clones were finally free. Free to age, free to scatter, free to carry their memories into a future that had never been built with them in mind. In the weeks after Jakku, when the Galactic Concordance was signed, and the Empire's last organized military structures were folding away like ash in a solar wind, the New Republic faced a peculiar silence. Thousands of clone troopers still alive, scattered across the galaxy, and no one quite knew what to do with them. The medals came first, because medals were simple. They required no infrastructure, no legal recognition, no answer to the harder question of who these men had been and what they were owed. Mon Mothma's government approved pensions with genuine goodwill, I think, the kind of impulse that comes from having fought a war and won it, and wanting to believe that victory means something beyond survival. But the pensions arrived to addresses that were often wrong, to men living under assumed names in spaceport settlements, to clone troopers who had been scattered so completely and so thoroughly that the New Republic's administrative machinery could barely find them. Rex, aging visibly on silos with Wolf and Gregor, received his recognition with a kind of tired courtesy, as if he had already made his peace with the fact that official gratitude arrived far too late and too little. What haunts me about this period is not the coldness of the New Republic. I think their impulse was genuine, but the sheer adequacy of their response, the way it managed to be both sincere and insufficient without anyone quite noticing the contradiction. The clone troopers had not been property to the Jedi who commanded them during the Clone Wars. They had been brothers, soldiers, individuals with names earned through 3 years of blood and choice. But they had always been, legally and administratively, exactly property to everyone else. The New Republic inherited a galaxy where clone troopers had no legal personhood, no citizenship records, no documented existence as anything other than military assets created and then discarded by the regimes that made them. There were no birth certificates, no family records, no way to integrate men who did not, in any official sense, exist as citizens. I find myself thinking about this a lot. The New Republic wanted to honor them, wanted to do right by them, and discovered that the machinery for doing right by them had to be invented from nothing. The clone troopers themselves seemed to understand, with a kind of sad clarity, that the galaxy had moved on from needing them, and that medals and pensions were gestures made to the idea of them, not to the actual men. A clone trooper named Davis, who had drifted across the Outer Rim for years after his discharge, received a pension notice forwarded through 3 different spaceport postal offices, already aged to the physiological equivalent of a man in his 60s despite having lived fewer than 30 years. He did not go to receive his commendation in person. He could not have, really, given that his body was failing him in ways the New Republic's medical infrastructure was not equipped to address or even fully understand. The accelerated aging that had once been an asset, rapid maturation for quick deployment, was now the dominant fact of the surviving clone's existence, a biological countdown that no medal could slow. Some of the surviving clones, perhaps 30 or 40 across the entire known galaxy by 7 ABY, had found their way into the rebellion during the war, and those men at least had the small dignity of having chosen their service at the end, even if that choice was really only the option to be useful once more. But most of the clones who survived the transition to stormtroopers had simply vanished into the margins. The spaceports and mining colonies, the agricultural settlements on forgotten worlds, the maintenance crews and dock workers and cantina regulars who were just old men now physiologically, carrying histories no one asked about. The New Republic's historians began, in those early years, to write the history of the Clone Wars. And here is the cruelty I keep coming back to. They wrote it without the clones. The Clone Wars, as the New Republic's official narrative framed it, was a conflict orchestrated by Palpatine through the Separatist Alliance, in which the Jedi served as generals and the clone troopers served as their backdrop, their foot soldiers, their statistics. The depth of what the clones had become, the brotherhood, the individuality carved out in defiance of their engineering, the sacrifice that had shaped them into actual people, was absent from the official record. What remained was the strategic outline. The Jedi led, the clones followed and died, the Empire came, the Empire fell. The personal was erased as surely from the history books as it had been erased from the clone troopers' official status. I think about what it must have meant for a surviving clone like Rex or Cutter or Wolf to watch the war they had given everything to be reduced to a historical outline, a series of battles and dates, with no room for the names of the brothers they had lost, the choices they had made, the bonds they had forged in defiance of the very genetics that created them. The New Republic was not hostile to the clones. It simply did not know how to see them, how to make space for them in the architecture of what was being built. There were no clone regiments in the New Republic Defense Force. There were no clone voices in the government. There were no monuments to the specific sacrifice of the Grand Army of the Republic, only the general monuments to those who had fallen against the Empire. The clone troopers remained, even in victory and peace, precisely what they had been made to be. Invisible soldiers whose individuality was an accident of history, not a fact that anyone had ever intended to preserve. By 8 ABY, the first generation of the oldest surviving clones began to die, not from wounds or disease, but from simple accumulated cellular failure, their accelerated aging reaching its inevitable conclusion. No one marked these deaths in any official way. They passed as quietly as most of them had lived since the fall of the Empire, scattered across the galaxy, attended by whoever had remained their brothers or had become their closest approximation of family. And there is something in that quiet, something I think about, the way the clone story does not end in recognition, but in continuation, in a kind of invisible persistence in worlds that had already decided they had forgotten them. The unresolved legacy is not the lack of monuments or medals or speeches. Those came, inadequate as they were. The unresolved legacy is that the New Republic never quite decided what a clone trooper was, legally or morally or historically, and so the surviving clones were left to decide for themselves, and most of them decided to be quiet, to fade, to let their lives become stories that would never be written down. There is a profound sadness in that, but also, I think, a kind of dignity that no one planned for and no one could quite take away from them. 100 years and more have passed since the Clone Wars ended, and the men who fought in them are almost entirely gone now, their bodies consumed by the very genetic engineering that was meant to make them perfect soldiers. In the historical archives of the New Republic and later the Galactic Federation, what remains of the clones exists primarily as footnotes, statistics appended to larger narratives about the fall of the Jedi, the rise and collapse of the Empire, the heroism of the rebellion. The clones themselves, as individuals, as brothers, as the architects of their own small culture of meaning inside the machinery of their creation, that part scarcely appears in the official record at all. I find myself thinking about how history works, how we transform lived experience into myth, and how the more distant an event becomes, the less likely we are to see the people inside it. The Clone Wars are taught now as a strategic catastrophe, a 3-year conflict that destabilized the Republic and killed millions, but the soldiers themselves have become abstractions. Clone troopers, the Grand Army, engineered soldiers whose accelerated aging made them obsolete. The names are gone. Cody, Rex, Wolf, Gregor, Cutter, Devis, the thousands of others who painted their armor and called themselves Vode, brothers, in a language no one else in the galaxy spoke. What survives of them in the collective memory is almost entirely wrong, built from pieces that were never quite true. There are stories, of course, the sort of thing you hear in spaceport cantinas from old spacers and retired military officers, whispered accounts that become stranger with each retelling. One version claims that the clone army was a Republic secret so total that even the Senate did not know about it, that the clones simply appeared at Geonosis, as if conjured, fully grown soldiers who had never been children. Another says they were mindless drones, biological automatons without genuine consciousness, operated entirely by remote control from some mysterious planet. A third holds that the clones were created by the Jedi themselves as a weapon against the Separatists, that the Jedi knew what they were making and knew what would happen when Order 66 came. The truth, which was that the clones were grown from a single genetic template on a specific world, that they were engineered for loyalty but became individuals anyway, that they built something real in the forge of war and then were methodically discarded. That truth has become too complicated, too sad, perhaps too inconvenient for easy inclusion in the historical consensus. What people prefer to remember is simpler. The clones were soldiers, they served their purpose, they aged out and were replaced, and the galaxy moved on. There is a kernel of truth in that, I suppose, but it misses everything that mattered. In the deep collections of certain restricted archives, if one knows where to look and has clearance to look, one can still find fragments. Duty rosters from Imperial ships, discharge records from 17 BBY, the fragmentary logs of clone units being reassigned, scattered, or decommissioned. These documents are bureaucratic and cold, but they are real, and they document the quiet, methodical process by which the Empire made the clones disappear without ever making a public proclamation that they were doing so. But almost no one reads those records, and almost no one cares to. The dominant myth has settled. The clones were efficient, They were useful for the Republic. They became less useful for the Empire, and so the Empire replaced them with stormtroopers. This is not entirely false, but it transforms a deliberate choice into an inevitability, a strategy into mere logic. It allows the Empire's decision to seem rational rather than cruel, and it removes from the story any suggestion that actual beings suffered in the process. There are, scattered across the galaxy, a handful of accounts from clones themselves, recorded before they died, interviews, memoirs, personal logs left behind in archives that have since been forgotten or sealed. A clone named Cutter, it is said, spoke before his death about waking up in an empty barracks and realizing his brothers were gone, and the only thing waiting for him was a form asking him to sign away his life for Imperial service. Rex left behind recordings of his time on silos, hunting Juper from a walker with Wolf and Gregor, 3 ancient men in a walker, moving across a desert world that no one cared about. There are accounts of clones hiding in stormtrooper ranks, painting white helmets over the individualizing marks that had meant something to them, becoming the very thing the Empire had been phasing them out to create. These voices, when they emerge from the archives, carry a kind of devastating clarity. They are not myths or retellings, but the direct speech of men who lived through what happened to them, trying to explain to an audience that mostly will not listen. But each of these accounts is treated as a historical curiosity, a primary source document notable mainly for how it confirms what we already think we know. What is lost in that treatment is the presence of consciousness within the event, the sense that this was not a process that happened to inanimate resources, but something that happened to people, to brothers, to men who had built a genuine culture inside the machinery of their own oppression. There is something almost obscene, I think, in how completely history has transformed them into myth, and how thoroughly the myth erases them. The clones were designed to serve, and then they were designed to be forgotten, and then they were designed to become legends so distant and strange that no one quite believed they were real at all. It is a kind of triple erasure, first from life, then from memory, and finally from the possibility of being remembered as what they actually were. And yet the fact that I am telling you this now, and that you are listening to a story that dwells on who they were rather than what they did, suggests that some impulse toward remembrance persists, even 100 years later. I do not know what that impulse is or where it comes from, but I find myself grateful for it, grateful that somewhere in the deep structure of how we tell ourselves stories, there remains a place where the humanity of forgotten soldiers might still echo, even if no one quite hears it anymore. The clones were made to be perfect, to be obedient, to be expendable, and despite everything the Empire did to ensure they would be forgotten, they were also made to be people, and something of that personhood, I believe, survives. You know, I find myself thinking about the last one a lot, the very final clone trooper, the last person alive who carried in his own body the lived memory of why his brothers were replaced and forgotten, and what that silence must have felt like when it came.